Hello, everyone, and welcome back to X-Ranger. Before we begin, I thought it would be interesting if each of you could leave a comment indicating which part of the world you're joining us from. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Now let's get comfortable, relax, and start our program. I've been living on this 53-acre property in East Texas for about 4 years now, and I still can't shake the feeling that something's not quite right out here. When I first bought the land near Avenger, I was thrilled. It had this beautiful spring-fed creek running through dense forest. Seemed like the perfect spot to build a little cabin and get away from it all. But man, if I'd known then what I know now. It started small at first. Just little things that were easy to brush off. I'd be out working on the cabin and hear these weird knocking sounds coming from the trees. At first I figured it was just woodpeckers or branches knocking together in the wind, but it kept happening, even on still days. And the sounds were loud, way too loud to be a bird. It was like someone was out there in the woods, smacking the trees with a baseball bat or something. Then the howls started. I've heard coyotes and wolves before, but this was different. These howls were deep and guttural, almost human-sounding, but not quite. They'd echo through the trees at night and send chills down my spine. My dog would go nuts, barking his head off and refusing to go outside. I tried to tell myself it was just some kind of weird local wildlife, but deep down, I knew that wasn't it. Things really started to get freaky when I'd hear footsteps outside the cabin at night. Not animal footsteps. These were clearly bipedal, like a person walking, but the stride was way too long to be human. I'd hear them crunching through the leaves, circling the cabin. A few times I worked up the courage to look outside, but I never saw anything, just trees and shadows. The smell was the worst part, though. It would come out of nowhere. This absolutely rank stench of rotten eggs mixed with wet dog. So strong it would make my eyes water. And it always seemed to come right before or after one of the other weird occurrences. I started asking around town, trying to see if any of the locals had experienced anything similar. Most people just laughed it off or looked at me like I was crazy. But my nearest neighbor, Old Bill, who lived about a mile down the road, he got real quiet when I mentioned it. Said he'd been hearing and smelling strange things for years, but learned it was best not to talk about it. I was starting to seriously consider selling the property and getting the hell out of there. But then something happened that I still can't explain to this day. I was out near the creek one morning, clearing some brush. I came across a copperhead snake, a big one, probably 4 feet long. It was already dead. Looked like it had been crushed by something. I left it there, figuring some animal would eventually drag it off. Later that afternoon, I went back to the same spot to finish up my work. The snake was still there, but it had been moved. Not just a little bit. It was now laid out in a perfectly straight line, pointing directly at my cabin. There's no way that happened naturally. Something or someone had deliberately placed it that way. That's when I saw the footprint, right next to the snake, pressed into the soft mud of the creek bank. It was huge, easily 16 inches long and 8 inches wide. 5 toes, just like a human foot, but massively oversized. And the stride length. I followed the tracks for a bit, and each print was at least 6 feet apart. I stood there for what felt like hours, just staring at that footprint. My mind was racing, trying to come up with some rational explanation. But there wasn't one. Whatever had left that print wasn't human, and it sure as hell wasn't any known animal. I snapped a few pictures with my phone, then hurried back to the cabin and locked myself in. I barely slept that night, jumping at every little sound. The next morning, I went back to show my son, who was visiting for the weekend, but the prints were gone, washed away by the rain that had fallen overnight. After that incident, things actually started to calm down a bit. The weird noises became less frequent, and I stopped smelling that awful stench. I noticed the wild hog population on my land had dropped significantly too. At first I was relieved, thinking maybe whatever it was had moved on. But then I started to wonder, what if it wasn't gone, but just getting better at hiding? The thought that this thing might still be out there watching me makes my skin crawl. I've tried to do some research to figure out what the hell could be living in these woods. I've read about Bigfoot sightings and other cryptids, but none of it quite matches up with what I've experienced. This is something different, something that doesn't fit into any category I know of. I still live on the property, but I'm a lot more cautious now. I don't go out at night if I can help it, and I always carry a gun when I'm working in the more remote areas. I've thought about setting up game cameras, but part of me is afraid of what I might capture on film. Sometimes I wonder if I'm just going crazy, if all of this is somehow in my head. But then I'll catch a glimpse of something moving just at the edge of the tree line, or hear that faint knocking sound in the distance, and I know it's real. I don't know what's out there in the woods of East Texas, but I do know one thing. We're not alone out here. There's something else, something that doesn't want to be seen or understood, and as much as it terrifies me, I can't help but be fascinated by it too. I've thought about reporting my experiences to the local authorities or maybe some kind of research group. But who would believe me? And more importantly, what if drawing attention to it makes things worse? For now, I'm keeping quiet, just watching and waiting. Maybe someday I'll work up the courage to really investigate, to try and get proof of whatever's out there. Until then, I'll just keep living with this strange, uneasy feeling. The feeling that something is always watching, always just out of sight. The feeling that the woods around my property are hiding secrets that we're not meant to understand. So if you're ever driving through East Texas and you see a little cabin off in the woods, maybe think twice before stopping. You never know what might be lurking just beyond the trees. Story 2. The first time was back in 2005. I was living in Grand Junction, Colorado at the time, working as a lumberjack. My buddy Joe and I decided to go fishing one weekend at this secluded spot we knew about. It was a beautiful day, clear blue skies, not too hot. We drove out to this field near the edge of town, parked the truck, and hiked about a mile to reach the creek. We'd been fishing for a couple hours, enjoying the peace and quiet, when Joe noticed this weird concrete slab nearby. It was maybe 10 feet square, completely out of place in the middle of nowhere. We walked over to check it out, wondering what the hell it could be for. That's when things got weird. I heard this low rumbling sound coming from the woods behind us. At first I thought it was just the wind, but it kept getting louder. Joe and I looked at each other, both sensing something wasn't right. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. Suddenly, this massive thing burst out of the tree line about 50 yards away. I'll never forget the sight of it. It had to be at least 8 feet tall, covered in dark, matted fur. But it wasn't a bear. It was standing upright on 2 legs. Its arms were huge, hanging down past its knees. For a split second, we just stared at each other in shock. Then it let out this horrifying roar, not like any animal I've ever heard. It was deep and guttural, but almost had hints of speech in it. My blood ran cold. Joe yelled, "Run!" and we both took off sprinting towards the truck. I could hear heavy footsteps pounding behind us, getting closer. My heart was racing, adrenaline pumping through my veins. I didn't dare look back. We made it to the truck and peeled out of there as fast as we could. Joe was white as a sheet, hands shaking on the wheel. We drove in silence for a while, both trying to process what the hell just happened. When we finally talked about it, we agreed it had to be some kind of bear. What else could it be? But deep down, I knew that wasn't right. Bears don't stand up like that, or make sounds like that. And the intelligence in its eyes, it was unsettling. I tried to put it out of my mind after that. Told myself I was just spooked and imagining things. But a few years later, it happened again. It was 2011, and I had moved to Mesa, Colorado. I was dating this girl at the time. Let's call her Amy. One night, we drove out to this secluded spot on my friend's ranch to, well, you know. We parked near an old cattle corral and climbed up on the roof of my SUV to look at the stars. Things were getting pretty heated when I heard that sound again, that low, rumbling growl that made my skin crawl. Amy didn't seem to notice at first, but I went rigid. My eyes scanned the darkness, desperately searching for the source. Then I saw it, standing by the edge of the corral, partially hidden in shadow, but I could make out its massive silhouette, those long arms, the matted fur. It was watching us. I tried to stay calm, not wanting to freak Amy out, but my heart was pounding so hard I was sure she could hear it. I whispered that we should probably head back, making up some excuse about it getting late. As we climbed down from the car, I kept my eyes locked on the creature. It didn't move, just stood there breathing heavily. The sound of its breath sent chills down my spine. We got in the car and I started the engine. As the headlights came on, they illuminated the corral for a split second. The creature was gone. I floored it out of there, tires kicking up dust. Amy could tell something was wrong, but I couldn't bring myself to tell her what I'd seen. How could I explain it without sounding crazy? These encounters have haunted me for years. I've done research, trying to find any explanation for what I saw, but nothing quite fits. It wasn't a bear or a moose or any other animal native to Colorado. Some people have suggested it could be a Bigfoot, but I'm not sure I believe in that stuff. All I know is that it was real, it was terrifying, and I hope to God I never see it again. I still go camping and fishing, but I'm always on edge now. Every snapping twig or rustling bush makes me freeze up. I find myself scanning the tree line, half expecting to see those eyes staring back at me. The worst part is not knowing. Not knowing what it was, why it was there, or if I'll ever encounter it again. It's the uncertainty that keeps me up at night. I've thought about reporting it to authorities, but what would I say? I saw a giant fur-covered creature that walks on two legs. They'd think I was nuts, so I've kept it to myself until now. I'm sharing this because I need to know if anyone else has had similar experiences. Am I crazy? Was it all just in my head? Or is there something out there in the Colorado wilderness that we can't explain? Sometimes I try to rationalize it. Maybe it was just a bear standing up, and my mind filled in the rest. But then I remember the intelligence in its eyes, the almost human-like quality to its stance, and I know deep down that it was something else entirely. I've become obsessed with trying to understand what I saw. I've read countless books on cryptozoology, watched every documentary I could find, but nothing quite matches up with my experience. The concrete slab in the first encounter still puzzles me. What was it doing out there in the middle of nowhere? Was it somehow connected to the creature? I've thought about going back to look for it, but the fear of another encounter holds me back. I find myself analyzing every detail of those encounters, trying to make sense of it all. The way it moved, the sounds it made, the look in its eyes. It's like my brain is constantly trying to solve a puzzle with missing pieces. The encounters have changed me. I'm more cautious now, always aware of my surroundings. I don't take the wilderness for granted anymore. There's a respect, but also a fear that I never had before. I wonder if it's still out there, roaming the Colorado wilderness. Are there more of them? Do they watch us, staying hidden just out of sight? The questions are endless, and I fear I'll never have answers. Sometimes I dream about it. I'm back in that field, or by that corral, and I see it emerging from the shadows. But in my dreams, it speaks. It tries to tell me something, but I always wake up before I can understand. I've thought about setting up trail cameras, trying to capture evidence, but part of me is afraid of what I might find. What if I'm right? What if there really is something out there that science can't explain? And what if it finds me again? The thought keeps me up at night sometimes. I find myself checking the locks, peering out windows into the darkness. It's like living with a constant low-level anxiety. I know this all sounds crazy. If someone had told me this story before my encounters, I probably wouldn't have believed them. But I know what I saw. It was real, it was terrifying, and it changed my life forever. So I'm putting this out there, hoping that maybe someone else has seen it too. Maybe together we can make sense of what's out there in the wilderness. Because until I understand what I saw, I don't think I'll ever truly feel at peace. If you've had a similar experience or know something about what I might have encountered, please reach out. I need to know I'm not alone in this. I need to know I'm not crazy, because the alternative, that there really is some unknown creature out there, is almost too terrifying to contemplate. But deep down, I know the truth. There's something out there in the Colorado wilderness, something that defies explanation. And until I understand what it is, I'll never stop looking over my shoulder, wondering when I might see those eyes staring back at me again. Story 3. I was just a kid back in '72, but that summer changed everything for me. It was the 4th of July, and like any other 11-year-old, I was buzzing with excitement for the fireworks and festivities. Little did I know that the real fireworks would happen in broad daylight, leaving a mark on me that I'd carry for the rest of my life. My name's Brian, and I grew up in Victoria, Illinois, a tiny speck on the map that most folks have never heard of. That day, I was hanging out with my buddies Greg and Russell, along with my cousin Paul. We were always looking for adventure, and the old coal mining areas on the outskirts of town were our playground. Our parents had warned us to stay away, but what kid listens to that? The sun was beating down hard that afternoon as we trekked through the overgrown paths. The air was thick with humidity, and I remember the constant buzz of cicadas in the background. We were laughing, shoving each other around, just being typical boys on summer break. That's when we heard it. A cow bellowing like I'd never heard before. It wasn't just a normal moo. This was a sound of pure terror. We all froze, looking at each other with wide eyes. "What the hell was that?" Greg whispered. None of us had an answer, but curiosity got the better of us. We crept forward, pushing through some bushes to get a better view. What I saw next, I still struggled to put it into words. There, not 50 yards away, was something straight out of a nightmare. At first, I thought it was a person, a really, really tall person. But as my eyes focused, I realized this was no human. This thing stood at least 8 or 9 feet tall, its body covered in a creamy white fur that seemed to shimmer in the sunlight. The cow was there too, backed up against a tree, still making that awful noise. The creature was just standing there, observing the animal. Its massive arms hung at its sides, ending in hands that looked eerily human-like, but much larger. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. It felt like time had stopped. Then, without thinking, I let out a strangled yell. "Guys, look!" That's when it turned. Oh, God, when it turned and looked right at us. I'll never forget that face as long as I live. It was pink and wrinkled, almost like an old man's face, but wrong. There was no neck. The head just sort of melded into its shoulders. But its eyes, they were intelligent, aware. For what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a few seconds, it just stared at us. Then, it tilted its head to the side, almost like it was curious. I remember thinking, absurdly, that it looked like my dog does when he hears a strange noise. Then, as calmly as you please, it turned and walked away. But walked doesn't do it justice. This thing moved with a grace that shouldn't be possible for something so large. Each step it took must have been 5 feet long, easily clearing fallen logs and debris without breaking stride. We stood there, frozen, long after it disappeared into the tree line. Russell was the first to break the silence. What the fuck was that?" His voice was shaking, and I realized mine would be too if I tried to speak. Paul grabbed my arm, his nails digging in. "We need to get out of here, now." None of us argued. We ran back towards town faster than I've ever run in my life, constantly looking over our shoulders. When we got back to my house, we were all out of breath and on the verge of tears. My mom took one look at us and knew something was wrong. "Boys, what happened?" We tried to explain, talking over each other, our words jumbling together in a mess of big and white and monster. My mom, bless her, thought we were making it up at first. But as she looked at our pale faces and trembling hands, she realized this wasn't just some kid's game. She called the police, and within an hour, a couple of state troopers were at our house. I'll never forget the look on their faces as we recounted what we saw. They weren't dismissive like I expected. Instead, they exchanged glances that said more than words ever could. One of them, Officer Johnson, I think his name was, knelt down in front of me. "Son, I need you to tell me exactly what you saw, every detail you can remember." So I did. I told him about the white fur, the pink face, the way it moved. As I spoke, I saw him nod slightly, like he was confirming something to himself. After we finished, the officers stepped outside with my mom. I couldn't hear everything they said, but I caught snippets. Not the first report. Keep this quiet. Panic in town. That night, as the fireworks exploded overhead, I sat in my room, unable to join in the celebration. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that face staring back at me. I kept replaying the encounter in my mind, questioning if it was real or if somehow we had all shared the same hallucination. In the days that followed, our story spread through town like wildfire. Some people believed us, others laughed it off as an overactive imagination or a prank gone too far. But there were a few, mostly older folks, who would nod solemnly when they heard our tale. They had stories of their own, passed down through generations, of strange creatures in the woods. It wasn't until years later that I learned we weren't alone in what we saw that day. Other sightings had been reported in the area around the same time. A truck driver on Route 41 claimed to have seen a large white figure cross the road in front of him. An elderly couple on the outskirts of town said they heard strange noises and found massive, unidentifiable footprints in their garden. The encounter changed me. I became obsessed with researching similar sightings, not just in Illinois, but all over the country. I've spent countless hours poring over books, articles, and eyewitness accounts, trying to make sense of what I saw that day. Some nights, I still wake up in a cold sweat, the image of that creature vivid in my mind. I've tried to rationalize it over the years. Maybe it was a bear with some kind of skin condition. Maybe it was an escaped circus animal. But deep down, I know those explanations don't fit. What we saw that day was something other, something that shouldn't exist in our world, but does. I'm 62 now, and I've never seen anything like it again. But I know it's out there. Sometimes when I visit my hometown and drive past those old mining areas, I get a chill down my spine. I can almost feel those eyes on me again, watching, curious. To this day, Greg, Russell, Paul, and I have a bond that can't be broken. We don't talk about it much anymore, but when we do get together, there's always a moment where we lock eyes and we know we're all thinking about the same thing. That summer day in 1972, when our world got a whole lot bigger and a whole lot stranger. I don't expect everyone to believe my story. Hell, there are days I have a hard time believing it myself. But I know what I saw. And if you're ever driving through central Illinois and you see something big and white out of the corner of your eye, don't dismiss it. You might just be getting a glimpse of the same thing that's haunted my dreams for the past 50 years. Story 4. We arrived at our remote campsite near the Coeur d'Alene River late on a Friday afternoon. The area was beautiful but isolated, dense forest, rugged mountains, and not another soul for miles around. We set up camp and turned in early, planning to head out before dawn. The next morning, we hiked deep into the backcountry. It was a crisp fall day, perfect hunting weather. By mid-afternoon, we'd managed to take down 2 decent-sized elk. We field dressed them and hung the meat up in trees to keep it safe from predators overnight. We were feeling pretty good about our success so far. As dusk approached, we decided to do one last sweep of the area before heading back to camp. That's when things took a bizarre turn. We'd just crested a small ridge when we spotted a black bear about 100 yards away. Dean took the shot and dropped it cleanly. We were pumped. 3 animals in one day was more than we'd hoped for. But our excitement quickly turned to confusion and then fear. Just as we started approaching the downed bear, an ear-splitting scream echoed through the mountains. It was like nothing I'd ever heard before, not quite human, not quite animal. The sound sent chills down my spine. We all froze, looking at each other with wide eyes. "What the hell was that?" my dad whispered. Before anyone could answer, we heard it again, this time from the opposite direction, at least a mile away. How could something move that fast? The screams kept coming, jumping from one location to another in a matter of seconds. It was as if whatever was making the sound was circling us, closing in. With each scream, I felt my heart rate spike. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. "We need to get out of here, now." Dean's voice was shaky but firm. We didn't need to be told twice. We turned and started hustling back towards our camp, leaving the bear carcass behind. As we moved quickly through the darkening forest, the screams continued. They seemed to be coming from all around us, getting closer and more frenzied. I've never felt fear like that before. Pure, primal terror. Every instinct in my body was screaming at me to run. We practically sprinted the last half-mile to our camp. As soon as we got there, we grabbed our essentials and piled into Dean's truck. No one spoke as we tore down the rough logging road, desperate to put as much distance between us and whatever that thing was, as possible. It wasn't until we hit the main highway that anyone broke the silence. "What about the elk?" I asked, suddenly remembering the meat we'd left hanging. My dad shook his head. "We'll come back for it in the morning. No way in hell I'm going back there tonight." We drove to the nearest town and got a motel room for the night. None of us slept much. We kept replaying those unearthly screams in our heads, trying to make sense of what we'd heard. The next morning, we reluctantly drove back to our hunting spot. The whole way there, I was on edge, half expecting to hear those screams again. But the forest was quiet and still in the morning light. When we got to where we'd hung the elk meat, we were in for another shock. The trees were empty. Not just the meat, the ropes, the tarps, everything was gone. There wasn't a single trace left behind. Confused and a little spooked, we hiked over to where we'd shot the bear. Same thing. The carcass had vanished completely. No blood, no drag marks, nothing. It was as if the animal had never existed. We searched the area for hours, looking for any sign of our kills or some explanation for what had happened. But we found nothing. It was like the forest had swallowed up every trace of our hunt. The whole experience left me shaken. I've been hunting my whole life, but I've never encountered anything like this. Those screams, the incredible speed at which the source of the sound moved. The complete disappearance of 3 large animal carcasses. It all defies logical explanation. I've tried to rationalize it in the months since, Maybe it was some kind of territorial predator we disturbed. Maybe there was a landslide or flash flood that swept away the carcasses, though that doesn't explain the lack of any evidence. But deep down, I know that none of the normal explanations fit. Whatever happened out there in those Idaho mountains, it was something beyond my understanding, something that shouldn't exist in our world. I still have nightmares about those screams sometimes. I haven't been back to that area since, and I'm not sure I ever will. Some things are better left alone. But I can't shake the feeling that whatever we encountered out there is still roaming those mountains, waiting for the next unsuspecting hunters to wander into its territory. I'm sharing this story because I need to get it off my chest, and because I want to warn others who might be planning to hunt in that area. Be careful out there. There are things in this world that we can't explain, things that defy our understanding of what's possible, and sometimes it's better not to find out what they are. Story 5. At first, I thought it was a bear, but as we got closer, I realized this thing was way bigger than any bear I'd ever seen. It must have been 700, 800 pounds easy, with muscles rippling under its dark fur, even in the dim light from my headlights. The rain was coming down in sheets, but I could make out its elongated face, almost like a mix between a bear and a wolf. But the craziest thing was its tail. This thing had a massive tail, at least 5 or 6 feet long. I'd never seen anything like it. Sarah gasped and grabbed my arm as we slowed to a crawl, not wanting to startle the creature. It turned and looked right at us, and I swear those eyes glowed slightly in the darkness. A chill ran down my spine. The animal slowly lumbered across the road in front of us. Its movements were deliberate and powerful. When it reached the other side, instead of disappearing into the woods, it headed straight for Ostrander Creek. We watched in shock as it waded into the rushing water without hesitation. The creek was swollen from all the rain, but this thing acted like it was nothing. It snapped young trees along the bank like twigs, clearing a path. Some of those trees had to be 15 years old at least, but it just bulldozed right through them. The sound of splintering wood mixed with the pounding rain. Once it reached the other side, the creature shook itself off and then melted into the dense vegetation. The whole encounter only lasted maybe 2 minutes, but it felt like time had slowed down. Sarah and I sat there in stunned silence for a while, rain pattering on the roof. Finally, Sarah whispered, "What the hell was that thing?" I had no answer. It was like nothing I'd ever seen before. Not a bear, not a wolf, not anything I could identify. The sheer size and strength of it was mind-boggling. And that tail. I kept replaying the image in my mind, trying to make sense of it. We eventually continued on home, but I couldn't shake the encounter from my thoughts. Over the next few days, I scoured the internet for any information on large, bear-like animals with long tails. I even discreetly asked some of the old-timers at work if they'd ever seen anything strange in the woods around here. No one had any answers. I went back to that spot on Ostrander Creek later that week. Sure enough, there was a path of destruction through the vegetation on both sides. Young trees were snapped clean in half, with claw marks gouged into the bark. But beyond that, there was no other evidence of the creature's passing. No tracks, no hair samples, nothing concrete I could point to. It's been months now, and I still think about that night constantly. Sarah and I don't really talk about it. I think we're both a little freaked out still. But I find myself scanning the tree line whenever I drive those back roads at night, wondering if I'll catch another glimpse of that massive, inexplicable animal. Part of me hopes I never see it again. The raw power it displayed was terrifying. But another part of me is burning with curiosity. What was that thing? How has it stayed hidden all this time? Are there more of them out there? I know it sounds crazy. If I hadn't seen it with my own eyes, I wouldn't believe it either. But I know what I saw that rainy night on Delamitro Road. There's something out there in those woods that science can't explain. Something huge and powerful and completely unknown. And honestly, that scares the hell out of me. Story 6. I was never much of a believer in cryptids or the paranormal. Sure, I enjoyed a good Bigfoot documentary now and then, but I always chalked it up to overactive imaginations or misidentified bears. That all changed after what happened to my family and me during a camping trip in Oregon back in 2012. It was mid-February and unseasonably warm, so my wife and I decided to take our 2 young daughters camping for the weekend. We chose 4X Campground in Willamette National Forest, a beautiful spot nestled among towering evergreens with a pristine lake nearby. The girls, aged 5 and 6 at the time, were thrilled for their first real camping adventure. We arrived Friday afternoon and set up our large family tent near the shore of the lake. The campground was nearly empty that time of year, with only one other site occupied on the far side. As evening fell, we roasted hot dogs and s'mores over the fire, told silly stories, and sang camp songs. It was idyllic, the kind of precious family memory I'd imagined creating. If only I'd known then how the night would unfold. Around 9 p.m. we tucked the girls into their sleeping bags, and my wife and I stayed up a bit longer, enjoying the crackling fire and star-filled sky. The forest was incredibly still and quiet. Too quiet, I realized. No owls hooting, no small animals scurrying about. It was as if the woods were holding its breath. Just as we were about to turn in, we heard a loud crash from the direction of our tent. Alarmed, I grabbed the flashlight and rushed over. The large metal recycling bin we'd placed near our tent had been knocked over, its contents strewn about. "Must have been a raccoon," I said, trying to reassure my clearly unsettled wife. But even as the words left my mouth, I knew it wasn't true. The bin was far too heavy for a raccoon to topple. We quickly cleaned up the mess and climbed into the tent, zipping it securely behind us. The girls stirred briefly but didn't wake. For the next hour, we lay there listening intently to every little sound. Just as I was starting to relax, convinced it had been a fluke, we heard it. Heavy footsteps, slow, deliberate steps circling our campsite. Whatever it was big, much too big to be a person. My mind raced through the possibilities. Bear, elk. But the gait sounded bipedal, not four-legged. The footsteps drew closer to our tent. My wife gripped my arm, her nails digging into my skin. I could hear her ragged breathing and feel my own heart pounding. The girls, mercifully, remained asleep. Suddenly, the side of the tent caved inward as something massive pressed against it. I stifled a scream as an enormous hand-like shape became visible through the thin nylon. It was at least twice the size of my own hand. The fingers slowly curled, bunching the fabric. I was paralyzed with fear, unable to move or speak. The hand withdrew, and for a moment I dared to hope it was over. Then, without warning, it plunged into the tent, groping blindly in the darkness. My wife let out a strangled gasp as the massive hand came within inches of her face. I don't know what came over me, but in that moment, parental instinct overrode my terror. I lashed out, swinging our heavy metal flashlight at the intruding limb. There was a deep, rumbling growl, a sound so low I felt it in my chest more than heard it. The hand withdrew, and we heard the creature move away from the tent. But our ordeal wasn't over. A series of thunderous splashes erupted from the lake as something began hurling large rocks into the water. The impacts were deafening in the still night air. This continued for several minutes, punctuated by occasional grunts and huffs. And then, the strangest part of the entire encounter occurred. As I lay there, my mind reeling, I heard, or rather felt, words form in my head. A guttural voice that seemed to bypass my ears entirely. "Do not call me Bad Bear. I am Squatto." I have no explanation for this. I'm not claiming it was telepathy or anything supernatural. Maybe it was my brain's way of processing the trauma. but in that moment it felt absolutely real. The rock throwing eventually stopped, and the heavy footsteps receded into the forest. We spent the rest of the night huddled together, jumping at every little sound. As soon as dawn broke, we hurriedly packed up camp and got the hell out of there. Before leaving, I walked down to the lakeshore, and my blood ran cold. There in the mud was a single, massive footprint, easily 22 inches long. Next to it lay one of the rocks that had been thrown, far too heavy for a person to hurl any significant distance. That weekend changed my life. I went from a hardened skeptic to someone utterly convinced of Bigfoot's existence. In the years since, I've become heavily involved in the Bigfoot research community. I've learned that 4X Campground has a long history of sightings and strange encounters. I've tried to rationalize what happened that night. Maybe it was an elaborate hoax, or a bear with mange, or a shared hallucination brought on by campfire fumes. But deep down, I know what I experienced. I felt the raw power and intelligence behind that massive hand. I heard that voice in my head. Something is out there in our forests, something that defies conventional explanation. I can't prove it to the world, but I no longer need proof. I know what I saw, what I felt, and I'll never forget the night I came face to face with a legend. Story 7. The first couple days were pretty uneventful, just hiking through dense forest, setting up camp each night, and doing our usual call blasts and knocks. But on the third day, things started to get weird. We were trekking through a particularly remote area when we came across this bizarre scene, a small clearing with animal bones arranged in these unnatural patterns. At first I thought maybe it was just some punk kids messing around, but we were miles from any roads or trails. The whole thing gave me an uneasy feeling. That night, as we were sitting around the campfire, we started hearing these loud wood knocks echoing through the trees. Now, wood knocks are a common Bigfoot research technique. You knock on a tree to try to get a response. But these knocks seemed to be answering our own knocks in a deliberate way. It wasn't just random. There was a clear call and response pattern. I've been on dozens of these expeditions, and I'd never experienced anything like it. The knocks continued on and off for hours, always staying just out of sight in the darkness beyond our campfire light. None of us got much sleep that night. In the morning, we decided to try to track the source of the knocks. As we were hiking through a particularly thick patch of forest, I caught a glimpse of movement out of the corner of my eye. When I turned to look, I saw this dark, hair-covered head with a distinctive conical shape quickly duck behind a tree about 50 yards away. It was only for a split second, but the images seared into my brain. Whatever it was big, way bigger than a person. I called out to the others and we ran in that direction, but there was no sign of whatever I'd seen. The forest floor was covered in moss and pine needles, so there weren't any tracks. But the trees in that area had these weird scratches and bark stripped off about 8 feet up, way higher than a bear could reach. We were all pretty rattled after that, debating whether to call off the expedition. But we decided to push on for one more day. The next morning, we hiked to this small Alpine lake to refill our water. As we approached the muddy shoreline, Chris let out a yell. There in the mud were a series of huge barefoot prints, at least 11.5 inches long. They were deeply pressed into the mud with clearly visible toe impressions. We took tons of photos and measurements. The prints led right into the water and didn't come back out anywhere we could see. It was like whatever made them had just walked straight into the lake and vanished. We searched the entire shoreline but found no other tracks. That was the final straw for us. We packed up and got out of there as fast as we could. On the hike back to our vehicles, we all had this overwhelming sense of being watched. Every snapping twig or rustle in the underbrush made us jump. I've never been so glad to get back to civilization. I've turned that expedition over in my mind countless times in the years since. I can't explain what we experienced out there. The arranged bones, the intelligent responses to our knocks, that glimpse of something huge and hair-covered, those massive footprints, it all points to something beyond conventional explanation. Before that trip, I was skeptical about Bigfoot. Now I'm convinced there's something out there in those forests that science hasn't accounted for. Whatever it is, it's intelligent, it's powerful, and it doesn't want to be found. That expedition changed my whole worldview. I still go out in the woods, still do research trips, but I'll never again feel truly alone in the wilderness. There's always that nagging sense that something could be watching from just beyond the tree line. I've learned to respect the forest and its secrets. Sometimes late at night when the house is quiet, I'll hear a faint knock in the distance. It sends chills down my spine every time. Is it just a branch falling, or is it something trying to communicate? I'll probably never know for sure, but I'll also never forget what I experienced on that mountain all those years ago. The wildlife biologists and anthropologists can debate all they want, but until you've been out there and seen it for yourself, you can't understand. There are things in this world that defy our current understanding. I'm just glad I made it out to tell the tale. I know a lot of people won't believe me. That's fine. I probably wouldn't have believed it myself if I hadn't lived through it. But I know what I saw, what I heard, what I felt, and I'll never be the same. Sometimes I wonder if we should have stayed longer, tried to make contact somehow. But then I remember that feeling of absolute terror as we hiked out of those mountains. Whatever's out there, it's not meant for us to understand. Maybe it's better left alone in the vastness of the wilderness. I still have nightmares sometimes. Flashes of that hair-covered head, the sound of wood knocks getting closer and closer, those massive footprints leading into the dark water. I wake up in a cold sweat, heart pounding. The expedition was supposed to gather evidence to further our scientific understanding. Instead, it left me with more questions than answers. But one thing I know for certain, I'll never look at the forest the same way again. There are mysteries out there, ancient and powerful, and sometimes, just sometimes, they let themselves be glimpsed by those who venture into the wild places of the world. I've told this story to a few close friends over the years. Some believe me, some think I'm crazy. But I know what I experienced, and I know that somewhere out there, in the shadows between those two great mountains, something is watching and waiting, something that doesn't want to be found. So if you ever find yourself hiking in those remote areas, keep your wits about you. Listen for knocks in the night. Watch for movement in the trees. And if you come across any strangely arranged bones or massive footprints, it might be best to turn back. Some mysteries are better left unsolved. As for me, I'll keep searching, keep asking questions, but I'll do it with a newfound respect for the unknown. Because now I know we're not alone out there in the wilderness, not by a long shot. Story 8. I've always loved getting out into nature, away from the noise and chaos of everyday life. There's something so peaceful about sitting around a campfire under the stars, listening to the sounds of the forest at night. At least, that's what I used to think before that fateful night changed everything. I had set up my small one-person tent in a secluded spot about a mile off the main trail. It was a beautiful area, surrounded by towering pines and a babbling creek nearby. As night fell, I crawled into my sleeping bag, looking forward to a restful sleep in the wilderness. At first, everything was quiet and still. But sometime in the early hours of the morning, I was jolted awake by a strange sound. It was like something small hitting the outside of my tent. Plink, plink, plink. My heart started racing as I realized someone, or something, was throwing pebbles at my tent. I held my breath, straining my ears to hear any other sounds. For a few moments, there was only silence. Then I heard slow, heavy footsteps circling my tent. Whatever it was big, much bigger than a person. The footsteps stopped right outside the entrance to my tent. I was frozen in terror, not daring to move a muscle. That's when I heard the most blood-curdling sound, something dragging a rock slowly up and down the metal tent pole. The high-pitched scraping noise sent chills down my spine. My mind was reeling, trying to make sense of what was happening. Was this some kind of sick prank? A bear, maybe? But deep down, I knew this was something else entirely, something that shouldn't exist. Just when I thought it couldn't get any worse, I saw movement at the entrance of my tent. To my absolute horror, an enormous hand started pushing its way inside. The fingers were massive, easily 14 inches across. It moved in a slow, sweeping motion, as if searching for something, or someone. I've never felt fear like that before in my life. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. I was paralyzed with terror, unable to do anything but stare at that monstrous hand. Every instinct was screaming at me to run, to fight, to do something. But I knew if I moved even an inch, whatever that thing was would know I was there. And I was certain that would be the end of me. So I lay there, utterly still, hardly daring to breathe as the gigantic hand explored my tent. It felt like an eternity, though it was probably only a minute or two. Finally, agonizingly slowly, the hand retreated and disappeared back outside. I heard those heavy footsteps again, moving away from my tent and fading into the forest. But I didn't move a muscle for hours, terrified it might come back. As the first rays of sunlight started to appear, I finally allowed myself to breathe again. When I emerged from my tent, there was no sign of whatever had visited in the night. No footprints, no broken branches, nothing. If it wasn't for the rock scrapes on my tent pole, I might have convinced myself it was all just a vivid nightmare. But I know what I saw, what I experienced. It was all too real. I packed up my gear in record time and got the hell out of there. As I hiked back to my car, I noticed my skin felt weirdly irritated and itchy. When I got home and looked in the mirror, I was shocked to see my entire body was covered in small blisters. The doctor later told me it was likely due to an extreme spike in blood pressure from the intense fear I'd experienced. It's been months since that night, but I still have trouble sleeping. Every little sound outside makes me break out in a cold sweat. I've tried to rationalize what happened, to come up with some logical explanation. But I know deep down that I encountered something that night that science can't explain. Something that shouldn't exist in our world. I don't know if it was Bigfoot or some other cryptid or what. All I know is that it was real. It was terrifying, and it's changed me forever. I used to love the peace and solitude of nature. Now, I can't shake the feeling that something is out there, watching and waiting in the darkness. I've debated whether or not to share this experience. Part of me is afraid people will think I'm crazy or making it up, but I need to get this off my chest. I need to know if anyone else has experienced anything similar, because the thought that I'm the only one who's seen this thing is almost as terrifying as the encounter itself. So I'm putting this out there, hoping someone can relate or offer some insight. All I know is that there are things in this world beyond our understanding, and sometimes ignorance really is bliss, because once you've seen something like that, you can never unsee it. You can never go back to the blissful unawareness of before. I don't know if I'll ever be able to go camping again. The thought of being alone in the wilderness fills me with dread now. That night took something from me that I'm not sure I'll ever get back, my sense of safety and wonder in nature. If you're reading this and planning a solo camping trip, please be careful out there. There are things in the darkness that we can't explain or understand. Things that can change your life in an instant. I hope nobody else ever has to experience the terror I did that night. But if you do, know that you're not alone. There are others out there who have seen the impossible, and lived to tell about it. As for me, I'm still trying to make sense of it all, still jumping at shadows and lying awake at night, wondering if that thing is out there somewhere, still hoping that one day I'll wake up and realize it was all just a bad dream, but knowing deep down that it wasn't, that it was all too real. So I'll keep searching for answers, keep trying to understand what happened that night. Because the alternative, accepting that there are monsters in this world that we can't explain, is almost too terrifying to bear. But I know what I saw, and I'll never forget it as long as I live. Story 9. I'll never forget that bone-chilling December morning back in '89. We'd just moved to a little cabin in Moyle County, Vermont, hoping for a quieter life away from the city. Boy, did we get more than we bargained for. It was about 6 a.m. when I woke up to let our dog, Max, out. The snow had fallen heavy overnight, blanketing everything in pristine white. As I opened the door, the frigid air hit me like a slap to the face. Max bolted out, clearly eager to do his business. I stood there on the porch, rubbing my arms for warmth, waiting for Max to finish up. But something was off. He wasn't sniffing around like usual. Instead, he was stock still, hackles raised, staring intently at something beyond the tree line. "Max, come on, boy," I called, but he didn't budge. That's when I noticed them, the tracks. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. The sheer size of the impressions in the snow. It didn't make sense. Curiosity got the better of me, and I stepped off the porch to get a closer look. My heart nearly stopped when I realized what I was seeing. These weren't just big footprints, they were enormous. Each one had to be at least 12 inches long, maybe even 14. And the stride length, it was inhuman. Whatever made these tracks was covering ground in massive leaps. I called out to my wife, Lisa, my voice cracking with a mix of fear and disbelief. She came out, wrapped in her robe, looking annoyed at first. But as soon as she saw the tracks, her face went pale. What made those?" she whispered, clutching her robe tighter. I shook my head, unable to form words. We both stood there, staring at the impossible prints in the snow. That's when Max started growling, a low, threatening sound I'd never heard from him before. Snapping out of our daze, we decided to follow the tracks, just to see where they led. In retrospect, it was probably a dumb move, but curiosity and adrenaline were driving us at that point. The tracks led us across our property, weaving between trees. What struck me as odd was how the prints seemed to just appear and disappear at random, like whatever made them could, I don't know, levitate or something. We came to a massive oak tree, and that's when things got even weirder. The tracks went right up to the tree, and then nothing. No broken branches, no disturbed bark, not a single leaf out of place. It was as if whatever made those prints had simply vanished into thin air. Lisa was shaking at this point, and I'll admit, I wasn't doing much better. The silence in the woods was deafening, broken only by Max's continued growling. We decided to head back to the cabin, both of us constantly looking over our shoulders. That's when we heard it, a sound that still haunts my dreams to this day. It was a low, guttural howl, unlike anything I've ever heard before. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, echoing through the trees. Max let out a yelp and took off running back to the house, tail between his legs. We didn't hesitate to follow, practically sprinting through the snow. As we ran, I swear I could hear heavy footsteps behind us, but I didn't dare look back. We burst through the front door, slamming it shut and locking it. Lisa was in tears, and I was struggling to catch my breath. Max had wedged himself under the couch, whimpering. For the rest of the day we stayed inside, peering out the windows, half expecting to see some monstrous creature emerge from the woods. But nothing came. As night fell, the tension in the cabin was unbearable. Every creak of the house settling, every gust of wind against the windows, it all sent shivers down our spines. We barely slept that night, huddled together in bed, with Max curled up at our feet. The next morning, I mustered up the courage to go outside and check. The tracks were gone, filled in by a fresh layer of snow that had fallen overnight. It was as if nothing had ever happened. We tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was just some elaborate prank, or maybe we'd both somehow imagined the whole thing. But deep down, we knew what we saw. Those tracks were real, and whatever made them was far from normal. We ended up selling the cabin a few months later. Couldn't bear to stay there, always wondering if that thing would come back. To this day, I can't explain what happened that December morning in Moyle County, but I know one thing for sure. There are things out there in this world that defy explanation, things that lurk just beyond the edge of what we understand. Sometimes on cold winter nights, I still wake up in a cold sweat, the echo of that inhuman howl ringing in my ears, and I wonder, is it still out there, leaving its impossible tracks in the snow? Story 10. As I rounded a bend, something caught my eye up ahead. At first I thought it was just shadows playing tricks on me, but then I saw it clearly, a large dark figure stepping out onto the road about 50 yards in front of me. My heart leapt into my throat. This was no deer or bear. It was walking upright on two legs, but it was massive, at least 7 or 8 feet tall. I slammed on the brakes instinctively. The tires screeched as the car fishtailed on the wet leaves covering the asphalt. I gripped the steering wheel with white knuckles, trying to keep control. As the headlights swept across the road, I got a better look at the thing for just a split second. It turned and looked right at me with glowing eyes that reflected the light. The face wasn't human, it was ape-like, but more intelligent-looking. Thick, matted hair covered its entire body. Its arms were long and muscular. In that moment of eye contact, I felt a chill of primal fear run through me, unlike anything I'd experienced before. Then, in the blink of an eye, it was gone. It moved with incredible speed and agility for its size, bounding off the road and disappearing into the thick forest alongside. The whole encounter lasted maybe 3 seconds, but it seared into my memory forever. My car had come to a stop sideways on the road. I sat there panting, hands shaking on the wheel. Did that really just happen? I tried to make sense of what I'd seen, but my mind was reeling. After a minute, I slowly got out of the car on unsteady legs. The woods were dead silent. No birds, no insects, nothing. Just an eerie stillness. I walked to where the creature had been standing and looked for tracks, but the pavement was dry there. A few yards away, though, I saw something that made my blood run cold. In the soft dirt on the shoulder of the road was an enormous footprint, easily 15 inches long. The toes were splayed wide, almost hand-like. I'd never seen anything like it. I ran back to my car, tires squealing as I sped away. My mind was racing, trying to rationalize what I'd seen. But deep down I knew I'd just had an encounter with Bigfoot. I'd always been skeptical of those stories, but now I was a believer. When I got home, I was still so shaken I could barely get my key in the door. I poured myself a stiff drink and tried to calm down. Should I call the police? Would anyone even believe me? I decided to keep it to myself for the time being. I needed time to process it. I barely slept that night, jumping at every little sound outside. The image of those glowing eyes watching me kept flashing in my mind. I called in sick to work the next day. There was no way I could function normally after what happened. Over the next few weeks, I scoured the local papers for any similar sightings, but found nothing. I drove by that stretch of road in the daytime, looking for any signs, but there was no trace left behind. It was like it never happened. But I know what I saw. I started researching Bigfoot sightings and was shocked to find quite a few reports from that area of Vermont over the years. Why hadn't I heard about this before? The more I dug, the more convinced I became that these creatures were real. But I also realized how crazy I'd sound if I told anyone. For months afterwards, I had trouble sleeping. Every time I drove at night, I'd be on high alert, scanning the roadsides. I avoided that particular road entirely. I kept replaying the encounter over and over, analyzing every detail. The way it moved, the intelligence in its eyes. It wasn't just some undiscovered ape. This was something more. I became obsessed, spending hours online reading about cryptozoology and Bigfoot theories. I even went back to that spot a few times with a camera, hoping to catch another glimpse. But I never saw anything again. It's like it vanished into thin air. The encounter changed me. I became more of a loner, withdrawing from friends who couldn't understand why I'd suddenly become so quiet and paranoid. How could I explain that I was terrified of running into Bigfoot again, that I was questioning everything I thought I knew about the world? It's been years now, and I still think about that night all the time. I've never told anyone the full story until now. Part of me still wonders if I imagined it all, if maybe I dozed off at the wheel and had some vivid hallucination. But then I remember the fear I felt, the print I saw, and I know it was real. I don't expect anyone to believe me. Hell, I'm not sure I'd believe it if someone else told me this story. But I know what I saw that night on that lonely Vermont road. There are things out there in the woods that science can't explain. I just hope I never come face to face with one again. Sometimes when I'm driving late at night, I still get that prickly feeling on the back of my neck, like I'm being watched from the trees. I'll catch movement out of the corner of my eye and my heart will race. But it's always just shadows and imagination. At least, that's what I tell myself. I've thought about reporting my sighting to one of those Bigfoot research groups. But I worry about attracting attention or being labeled as some kook. So I've kept it to myself all these years. Writing this out is the first time I've really told the whole story. I don't go camping anymore. I used to love hiking and being out in nature. But now the forest feels menacing, like there are eyes on me, something lurking just out of sight. I know it's irrational, but I can't shake the feeling. That brief encounter completely changed my relationship with the wilderness. Sometimes I wonder, what if I hadn't slammed on the brakes? What if I'd hit it? Would there finally be proof? Or would it have destroyed my car and possibly killed me? I'm glad I didn't find out. But part of me wishes I had some evidence beyond my own memory. I've had people tell me I must have seen a bear standing up, or maybe someone in a costume playing a prank. But they weren't there. They didn't see the inhuman intelligence in those eyes, or the impossible speed and agility of its movement. This was something else entirely. To this day, I'm hyper-aware whenever I'm driving on back roads at night. My eyes are constantly scanning the tree line. Every shadow and movement sets me on edge. I know the chances of seeing another one are astronomically low, but I can't help it. That night changed me forever. I often wonder if it's still out there, roaming the forests of Vermont. Does it remember our encounter too? Was it as startled by me as I was by it? So many questions that I'll likely never have answers to. All I know is that the world is a much stranger and more mysterious place than most people realize. If you're ever driving through Bennington County late at night, keep your eyes on the road, but also on the woods alongside. You never know what might be watching you from the darkness. And if you see something that doesn't make sense, that shouldn't exist. Trust your instincts and get out of there fast. Some mysteries are better left unsolved. Story 11. The day started out perfectly normal. I had hiked several miles into a secluded area, far from any trails or campsites. I found a peaceful clearing next to a babbling brook and set up my small tent. The weather was ideal, warm but not too hot, with a gentle breeze rustling through the trees. As afternoon turned to evening, I was relaxing by my campfire, reading a book and enjoying the solitude. The forest was alive with the sounds of birds and small animals. I felt completely at peace, a million miles away from the stresses of everyday life. But then something changed. It was subtle at first, just a slight shift in the atmosphere that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. The forest seemed to go quiet, as if holding its breath. I looked up from my book, scanning the trees around me. That's when I noticed some movement in the bushes about 20 feet away. At first I thought it must be a deer, or maybe a black bear. I slowly stood up, ready to grab my bear spray if needed. But what emerged from those bushes was like nothing I'd ever seen before or since. It didn't leap out dramatically like in a movie. It more unfolded itself, rising up from a crouched position. In the fading evening light, I could make out a vaguely human-like shape, but much taller, at least 7 or 8 feet. It was covered in dark, matted hair or fur. The body was lean but powerfully muscled, with long arms that hung down past its knees. But it was the face that truly chilled me to my core. Barely visible beneath a heavy brow ridge were 2 eyes that reflected the firelight, giving them an eerie glow. The face was deeply wrinkled, almost ancient-looking, with a flattened nose and a mouth set in a grimace that revealed yellowed teeth. For a moment that felt like an eternity. We just stared at each other. I was frozen in place, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I kept waiting for it to charge at me or make some kind of sound, but it just stood there, swaying slightly. Then, in a motion so fluid and fast I could barely track it, the creature dropped down onto all fours. It moved with an unsettling mix of animal and human-like movements, powerful and agile. Before I could even think to react, it had loped off into the darkening forest. I'd like to say I immediately packed up my gear and got the hell out of there. But the truth is, I was too terrified to move. I just stood there, straining my eyes and ears, convinced that at any moment the thing would come crashing back through the trees to attack me. As the minutes ticked by and nothing happened, my initial panic began to subside, replaced by a gnawing dread and confusion. What had I just seen? Was I going crazy? Had someone slipped something into my canteen as a twisted prank? I don't know how long I stood there. It could have been 10 minutes or an hour. Eventually, my survival instincts kicked in. I needed to get out of there, to get back to civilization and safety. But the thought of trying to hike out in the dark, potentially crossing paths with that creature, again, was unbearable. So I did the only thing I could think of. I climbed a tree. I grabbed my sleeping bag and a few essentials, leaving the rest of my gear behind. I found a sturdy oak with low branches and scrambled up as high as I dared, wedging myself into a relatively comfortable spot. From my perch, I had a view of my abandoned campsite below. The fire was starting to die down, casting eerie shadows. Every rustle of leaves or snap of a twig sent a jolt of adrenaline through my body. I kept replaying the encounter in my mind, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. As the night wore on, exhaustion began to set in. But I fought to stay awake, terrified of what might happen if I dozed off. I watched the moon slowly arc across the sky, counting down the hours until dawn. Just when I thought the night would never end, I heard something moving through the underbrush below. My whole body tensed, and I held my breath, willing myself to become invisible. Then I saw it, that same tall, hairy figure, moving on 2 legs this time. It paused at the edge of my campsite, its head swiveling as if searching for something. I pressed myself as flat against the tree trunk as I could, not daring to move a muscle. The creature sniffed the air, then let out a low, rumbling sound that was somewhere between a growl and a moan. It was a sound that seemed to vibrate in my very bones. After what felt like hours, but was probably only a minute or 2, the creature loped off into the forest again. I remained frozen in place, convinced it would return at any moment. But as the sky began to lighten with the first hints of dawn, I realized it was gone. As soon as it was light enough to see clearly, I scrambled down from the tree on shaky legs. I threw my remaining gear into my backpack as quickly as I could and started hiking out at a frantic pace, constantly looking over my shoulder. It took me most of the day to make it back to my car. I was scratched up, exhausted, and probably a bit dehydrated. But mostly, I was shaken to my very core. I drove straight home without stopping, my mind racing the entire time. In the days and weeks that followed, I tried to rationalize what had happened. Maybe it was just a bear walking on its hind legs. Maybe I'd eaten some bad berries and hallucinated the whole thing. But deep down, I knew what I'd seen was real. I've spent years researching, trying to find any reports of similar encounters in that area. I've found a few vague stories, but nothing concrete. I've never gone back to those woods, and I rarely talk about what happened. Who would believe me? But I know what I saw that night. And sometimes, when I'm alone in the quiet darkness, I swear I can still hear that low, rumbling moan echoing through the trees. It's a sound that will haunt me for the rest of my days. Story 12. My buddies John, George, and I were heading back from a camping trip in the Green Mountains. We'd spent the weekend hiking and fishing, just trying to get away from the daily grind for a bit. It was getting late, probably around 10 p.m., and we were cruising down Route 4A through Rutland County. The roads were empty and pitch black, with only our headlights cutting through the darkness. We had the radio on low, just sort of zoning out after a long day. John was driving, I was riding shotgun, and George was sprawled out in the back, half asleep. Suddenly, John slammed on the brakes and swerved. "Holy shit!" he yelled. I jolted forward, my seatbelt locking up. "What the hell, man?" I shouted, my heart racing. George sat up in the back, looking dazed and confused. John was white as a sheet, gripping the steering wheel so tight his knuckles were pale. He pointed ahead and stammered, Did you see that?" I squinted into the darkness beyond our headlights. At first I didn't see anything, but then my blood ran cold. There was something standing in the middle of the road about 50 feet ahead of us. It was massive, easily 7 feet tall, and it was covered in thick, matted black fur from head to toe. But the thing that really got me were its eyes. They were set deep in its face, almost hidden by its prominent brow, but I could see them gleaming in the headlights. They looked intelligent, aware. This thing was just standing there, staring right at us. It didn't move a muscle, didn't even seem bothered by our headlights shining on it. "What the fuck is that?" George whispered from the back seat. None of us had an answer. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. A bear, maybe? But it was standing on 2 legs, and the proportions were all wrong. Some guy in a costume? But who the hell would be out here in the middle of nowhere dressed like that? We sat there frozen for what felt like ages, but was probably only 30 seconds or so. John's foot was still jammed on the brake pedal. I could hear all our breathing, fast and shallow. Finally, John spoke up. Should we try to go around it?" I swallowed hard. "I don't know, man. What if it attacks the car or something?" George leaned forward between the seats. "Maybe we should back up. Get the hell out of here." Before we could decide, the creature slowly turned its head to look directly at me. I felt a chill run down my spine. Its eyes. There was something in them. Not animal, but not quite human either. I had the distinct feeling it was studying me, sizing me up. Then, without warning, it took a step towards our car. "Go, go!" I yelled. John stomped on the gas and we peeled out, tires squealing. I turned in my seat to look out the back window, half expecting to see the thing chasing after us, but the road behind us was empty. We drove in tense silence for a few minutes, all of us trying to process what we'd just seen. Finally, George spoke up. "Guys, what the hell was that thing?" John shook his head. "I don't know. I've never seen anything like it. You both saw it too, right? I'm not going crazy?" "We saw it," I confirmed. "Big hairy thing, standing right in the middle of the road. We spent the next few miles speculating. Bear, moose, some kind of escaped zoo animal. None of the explanations felt right. Deep down, we all knew we'd seen something unnatural. As the initial shock wore off, curiosity started to take over. Maybe we should go back, I suggested. See if it's still there. John looked at me like I was insane. Are you kidding? No way am I turning this car around. But George backed me up. Come on, man. When are we ever going to get a chance to see something like that again? We should at least check. After some debate, John reluctantly agreed to turn around. We drove back slowly, all of us on high alert, scanning the sides of the road. When we got back to where we'd seen the creature, there was no sign of it. We pulled over and got out, shining our flashlights into the woods on either side of the road. The darkness seemed to swallow up the beams. I felt exposed and vulnerable standing out there. "Hello?" George called out. His voice echoed in the still night air. No response. We searched for about 15 minutes, looking for tracks or fur or anything, but we found nothing. It was like the creature had never existed. As we got back in the car, a thought occurred to me. Hey, did any of you guys smell anything weird back there? When we first saw it, I mean. John and George both shook their heads. That's odd, I mused. You'd think a big hairy animal like that would have a pretty strong odor. But I didn't smell anything at all. The drive home was subdued. We were all lost in our own thoughts, trying to rationalize what we'd experienced. By the time we got back to town, we'd convinced ourselves it must have been some kind of optical illusion or shared hallucination. Maybe we were more tired from the camping trip than we realized, but in the days and weeks that followed, I couldn't shake the memory of those eyes staring into mine. The intelligence behind them, the feeling of being studied, evaluated. I started doing research, looking into local folklore and cryptid sightings, and I found some interesting things. It turns out Vermont has a long history of Bigfoot encounters. People have been reporting similar creatures in the Green Mountains for centuries. The more I read, the more convinced I became that what we saw that night was real. Some kind of undiscovered primate species, maybe even a remnant population of Neanderthals or other ancient hominids. I tried talking to John and George about it, but they both shut me down. They'd decided it was best to just forget the whole thing. But I couldn't let it go. I started spending my weekends driving out to that stretch of Route 4A, hoping to catch another glimpse. I never saw the creature again, but sometimes I'd get this prickly feeling on the back of my neck, like I was being watched from the woods. It's been over 30 years now since that night. I still think about it all the time. Was it really Bigfoot, some other cryptid, or just our imaginations running wild? I don't have any answers, but I know what I saw, and I know that there are things out there in this world that defy explanation. Things that lurk in the shadows, just beyond the reach of our understanding. So if you're ever driving down a dark, lonely road in Vermont, keep your eyes open. You never know what might be standing there, watching and waiting in the night. Story 13. I was just a young man of 19 when it happened, barely more than a boy, really. My friend Tom and I had set out early that crisp October morning to do some hunting in the Green Mountains. The leaves were at their peak, a glorious patchwork of red and gold blanketing the rugged landscape. We'd been tracking a buck for a couple hours, following its trail deeper into the wilderness. The air was cool and damp, mist still clinging to the hollows as the weak autumn sun struggled to break through. I remember the crunch of leaves and twigs under our boots, the earthy scent of decaying vegetation, the occasional cry of a blue jay piercing the stillness. We moved as quietly as we could, rifles at the ready, eyes scanning for any sign of movement. It was nearing midday when we came upon a small clearing. That's when I saw it, a flash of reddish-brown fur through the trees. My heart leapt, thinking we'd finally spotted our quarry. but as the figure emerged into the open, I felt my blood run cold. This was no deer. Standing there, not 30 yards away, was what I can only describe as a wild man. He, if it was indeed a he, stood about 5 feet tall, with a squat, powerful build. But what struck me most was the thick coat of bright red hair covering its entire body. The face was flat and ape-like, with deep-set eyes that gleamed with feral intelligence. A scraggly beard hung from its chin, matted with leaves and dirt. For a long moment, we all stood frozen, staring at each other in mutual shock. I couldn't believe my eyes. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Was this some kind of hermit driven mad by isolation, an escaped lunatic, or something else? Something not quite human? Tom was the first to react. With trembling hands, he raised his rifle and fired a wild shot. The boom shattered the silence, echoing off the mountains. The creature flinched at the sound, then let out a blood-curdling howl that raised the hair on the back of my neck. Before I could even think to raise my own weapon, it charged straight for us with terrifying speed. Panic seized me, all thoughts of hunting forgotten. We turned and ran for our lives. I could hear it crashing through the underbrush behind us, gaining ground with every stride. Its guttural roars spurred us on, filling me with a primal terror I'd never known before. We tore through the forest, heedless of direction, driven only by the instinct to escape. Branches whipped at our faces, roots threatened to trip us with every step. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but still we ran. I dared not look back, afraid of what I might see. In our frantic flight, we lost all sense of where we were. The familiar landmarks blurred into a chaotic jumble of rocks and trees. At some point, I realized I'd dropped my rifle, but there was no time to go back for it. Tom had lost his too, along with most of our supplies. I don't know how long we ran. It felt like hours, though it was likely only minutes. Eventually, the sounds of pursuit faded, but still we pressed on, too afraid to stop. It wasn't until we literally ran out of mountain, coming to the edge of a steep ravine, that we finally halted. We stood there gasping for breath, hearts pounding, straining our ears for any sign of the creature. But all was quiet, save for the rustle of wind through the trees and the distant call of a crow. As the adrenaline faded, the full weight of what had happened began to sink in. We were lost, unarmed, with night approaching, and who knows what lurking in these woods. I've never felt so vulnerable, so utterly out of my depth. Tom and I hardly spoke as we picked our way carefully down the ravine, hoping to find some landmark or trail that might lead us back to civilization. The light was fading fast, the forest taking on sinister shadows. Every snapping twig, every rustle in the bushes sent a jolt of fear through me. I kept imagining red fur and feral eyes watching us from the gathering gloom. It was well past dark when we finally stumbled upon an old logging road. We followed it for miles, jumping at every sound, before we came across a farmhouse. The kindly old couple who lived there were startled by our wild-eyed appearance, but they took us in, fed us, and sent word to our families. In the days and weeks that followed, we told our story to anyone who would listen. Most folks were skeptical, of course. Some thought we'd stumbled upon a bear and let our imaginations run wild. Others suggested we'd gotten into some bad moonshine. A few even accused us of making it all up for attention. But I know what I saw that day. The image of that red-furred wild man is seared into my memory. Sometimes I still wake in a cold sweat, the echo of that inhuman howl ringing in my ears. We never did find our rifles or the rest of our gear. I haven't set foot in those mountains since, and I doubt I ever will again. Some mysteries are best left unsolved, some wildernesses best left unexplored. But I often wonder, what was that creature? Where did it come from? And is it still out there, roaming the green mountains, waiting for some other unlucky soul to stumble into its domain? I don't expect anyone to believe me. Hell, there are days I can hardly believe it myself. But I know what I experienced that day was real. It changed me, opened my eyes to the possibility that there are things in this world beyond our understanding, things that lurk in the shadows of civilization, in the wild places we've forgotten or chosen to ignore. So the next time you're out in the wilderness and you hear something moving in the underbrush or catch a glimpse of something that doesn't quite fit, well, you might want to think twice before investigating. Some things are better left alone. I still have nightmares about that day. The red fur, those piercing eyes, that bone-chilling howl. They haunt me. I can't shake the feeling that we narrowly escaped something truly horrifying. What if we hadn't been able to outrun it? What would have happened if it had caught us? The encounter has left me with a deep-seated unease about the natural world. I used to find comfort in the forests, but now they feel oppressive, full of hidden dangers. Every shadow seems to conceal some nameless threat. I've tried to rationalize it, to tell myself it was just a bear or some other mundane explanation. But deep down, I know that's not true. I've done some research over the years, trying to make sense of what we saw. I've read accounts of similar creatures spotted in other parts of the country, things they call Bigfoot or Sasquatch. Some of the descriptions match what we encountered, but none capture the sheer otherness of the being we faced. This wasn't just some undiscovered ape or missing link. There was an intelligence in those eyes, a malevolence that felt almost supernatural. Tom and I don't talk about it much anymore. It's like an unspoken agreement between us. We know what we saw, but rehashing it only brings back the terror of that day. Sometimes I catch him looking off into the distance with a haunted expression, and I know he's remembering too. I've tried to move on with my life, to put that day behind me, but it's always there, lurking in the back of my mind. I find myself scanning the tree line whenever I'm near the woods, half expecting to see that red fur again. I startle easily at unexpected noises. My wife says I talk in my sleep sometimes, muttering about the wild man and pleading for help. Part of me wishes I could go back to that day, to try and get a better look at the creature or maybe even capture it somehow. But a larger part is grateful that we escaped with our lives. Whatever that thing was, it wasn't meant for our world. It belonged to an older, wilder time, when humans were prey as often as predators. I don't know if I'll ever fully come to terms with what happened that day. It challenged everything I thought I knew about the world and my place in it. But I do know this: I'll never look at the wilderness the same way again, and I'll always wonder, with a mixture of fear and fascination, what other secrets those ancient mountains might be hiding. Story 14. I'll never forget that day on the Davis farm. It was September 20th, 1985, and I was helping my buddy Bob Davis with some work around his property in Rutland County, Vermont. The leaves were just starting to change color, and there was a crisp fall chill in the air as we headed out to fix some fencing in the back pasture. Bob and I had been chatting and joking around as we worked, but suddenly he went quiet and stopped in his tracks. I looked up to see what had caught his attention, and that's when I saw it too. This massive, dark figure standing at the edge of the woods about 50 yards away. At first I thought it might be a bear, but as I squinted to get a better look, I realized this thing was standing upright on two legs. My blood ran cold as I took in its hulking 7-foot-tall frame covered in thick, matted fur. It had long arms that hung down past its knees, and even from that distance I could make out its broad, sloping forehead and deep-set eyes that seemed to be staring right at us. "What the hell is that thing?" I whispered to Bob, not wanting to make any sudden moves or noises. Before he could answer, the creature let out this guttural growl that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Then, to our horror, it started lumbering towards us with quick, purposeful strides. Panic set in as Bob and I turned and started running back towards the barn. I could hear heavy footsteps pounding behind us, getting closer by the second. Suddenly, a large rock whizzed past my head, missing me by inches. I glanced back to see the creature had stopped about 30 yards away and was hurling stones at us with incredible force and accuracy. We ducked and weaved as more rocks flew past, one catching Bob in the shoulder with a sickening thud. He cried out in pain but kept running. Just as we reached the relative safety of the barn, I heard a final roar of frustration from the beast before the sound of retreating footsteps. Panting and shaking, Bob and I slammed the barn door shut behind us and tried to process what had just happened. "Did you see that thing?" Bob gasped, rubbing his bruised shoulder. "It looked like some kind of giant ape or gorilla, but that's impossible out here." I nodded, still too shocked to speak. After catching our breath, we cautiously peered out the barn window. The creature was gone, but we could see several large rocks scattered on the ground where we had been running. We decided to head back to the farmhouse to tell Bob's family what had happened. His wife, Fran, was skeptical at first, but she could see how shaken up we were. As we recounted the terrifying encounter, Bob's teenage son, Jimmy, piped up. "I've been hearing weird noises at night lately," he said, "like howls and grunts coming from the woods. I thought it was just coyotes or something, but maybe it was that thing you saw." Fran admitted she'd noticed their dogs acting strangely over the past week, barking at the tree line and refusing to go outside after dark. And Bob's elderly father, Al, had complained about a foul, swampy odor drifting across the property on several recent evenings. As we talked, the pieces started coming together. This wasn't just a one-time sighting. There were signs that this creature had been lurking around the Davis farm for days, maybe even weeks. The next morning, we decided to investigate the area where we'd seen the beast. As we approached the tree line, that same rancid, musky smell hit us. Al had been right. It was like a mixture of wet dog and stagnant marsh water. That's when we spotted the tracks. Huge, bare footprints pressed deep into the soft earth, easily 14 inches long. They led from the woods to the spot where the creature had stood throwing rocks, then back into the forest. We followed the prints for a while, noticing broken branches and tufts of coarse hair snagged on tree bark along the way. The trail eventually led to a small cave opening, partially hidden by dense foliage. The pungent odor was overwhelming. None of us were brave or stupid enough to venture inside, but it seemed we had found the creature's lair. We took some photos and measurements of the footprints, then headed back to call the authorities. The local police were dubious of our wild claims, but agreed to send someone out to take a look. They didn't find much beyond the tracks we'd already documented. But word started to spread, and soon we had all sorts of self-proclaimed experts and Sasquatch hunters showing up to investigate. One guy who seemed more credible was Dr. Warren Cook, an anthropologist from a nearby university. He carefully made plaster casts of the footprints and collected hair samples to analyze. He also interviewed all of us about what we'd seen and heard. "Based on your descriptions and the physical evidence, it seems you may have encountered what's known as a wood ape or Sasquatch," Dr. Cook explained. "There have been similar reports in this region dating back decades, though a confirmed sighting is exceedingly rare. He advised us to set up game cameras around the property and keep detailed records of any further incidents. But as the days passed, the creature seemed to have vanished without a trace. The strange noises stopped, the dogs calmed down, and the putrid smell dissipated. Part of me was relieved, but I also felt unsettled by the lack of closure. What was that thing? Where did it go? Would it come back? Those questions haunted me. In the weeks and months that followed, we remained on high alert. Every snapping twig or rustling bush made us jump. I found myself constantly scanning the tree line, half expecting to see that massive, fur-covered figure emerge again. But life gradually returned to normal on the Davis farm. The autumn chill gave way to winter snow, then spring flowers, and still no sign of the creature. Dr. Cook's analysis of the hair samples proved inconclusive. Apparently, the DNA was too degraded to identify the species. Some locals accused us of pulling an elaborate hoax, while others became convinced a whole family of Bigfoots were living in the mountains. As for me and the Davises, we know what we saw that day. The terror was real. The huge footprints were real. The bruise on Bob's shoulder from that hurled rock was definitely real. To this day, I can't explain what happened on the Davis farm in September of 1985, but I know it changed me. I'm more cautious in the woods now, always watching and listening. And sometimes, when I catch a whiff of that swampy odor on the breeze, I wonder if our hairy visitor is still out there, lurking just beyond the trees, waiting to reveal itself again. Story 15. That night started off normal enough. We had a big barbecue dinner out on the deck, watching the sun set behind the Green Mountains. As darkness fell, we moved inside to play board games by the fireplace. Uncle Dave poured himself a whiskey and regaled us with tales of black bears and coyotes he'd encountered in the woods over the years. It must have been close to midnight when we first heard it. A high-pitched, piercing shriek echoed through the valley, causing us all to freeze mid-conversation. At first I thought it was just the wind, but then it came again, louder this time, and unmistakably some kind of animal cry. "What the hell was that?" my dad asked, looking to Uncle Dave. Uncle Dave's brow furrowed as he set down his glass. "Not rightly sure," he said slowly. "Doesn't sound like any critter I've heard round these parts before." We all crowded around the windows, peering out into the inky blackness beyond the porch light. For a few minutes all was silent except for the crackle of the fire. Then suddenly the cry rang out again, this time much closer. It was unlike anything I'd ever heard, a cross between a woman's scream and a mountain lion's yowl. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. "Jesus," Uncle Dave muttered. "Whatever it is, it's moving fast, real fast." He was right. Within seconds, we heard the sound again, this time from the other side of the cabin. Whatever was making that noise was circling us at an incredible speed. "How fast do you reckon it's going, Dave?" my dad asked, his voice tense. Uncle Dave shook his head in disbelief. "I'd say at least 20 miles an hour, maybe more. And that's on a steep slope in pitch darkness. No normal animal can move like that." By now, Tommy was clinging to my mom's leg, whimpering softly. I tried to act brave, but my heart was pounding. The cries were getting more frenzied, more desperate sounding, and they kept getting closer. Suddenly, we heard a cacophony of barking from down the road. "That's the Johnsons' place," Uncle Dave said. "Their dogs must have heard it too." Within seconds, more dogs joined in from other nearby cabins. The entire valley seemed to erupt in frantic barking as the creature raced past. "It's heading straight for us," my dad said grimly. Uncle Dave sprang into action, grabbing his hunting rifle from above the mantel. "Everyone stay inside," he ordered as he headed for the door. "I'm going to try to get a look at this thing." "Dave, don't!" my mum pleaded, but he was already out on the porch, rifle at the ready. The rest of us huddled by the window, watching Uncle Dave scan the tree line. The night was moonless, and beyond the small circle of porch light was total blackness. For a moment, all was quiet except for the distant barking. Then we heard it again, that bone-chilling shriek, so close it made my ears ring. Uncle Dave swung his rifle towards the sound. "Sweet Jesus," he whispered. That's when I saw it. Just for a split second, two glowing eyes reflected in the porch light about 7 feet off the ground. They blinked once, and then were gone. Uncle Dave fired off a shot, the muzzle flash briefly illuminating a massive dark shape as it darted between the trees. "Get back, Dave!" my dad yelled, yanking open the door. Uncle Dave stumbled inside, his face pale as a sheet. "What was it?" I asked, my voice shaking. "What did you see?" Uncle Dave shook his head, fumbling to reload his rifle. "I don't rightly know," he said, "but it was big, bigger than any bear I've ever seen. And fast, faster than should be possible for something that size. We spent the rest of that terrible night huddled together in the living room, jumping at every little sound. The creature circled the cabin for hours, screaming and howling. Sometimes it seemed to be right outside the walls. Other times, we'd hear it racing through the woods, its cries echoing off the mountainsides. None of us slept a wink. We just sat there, pale and terrified, as Uncle Dave kept his rifle trained on the door. I remember the sick feeling in my stomach, the cold sweat on my skin. Every time that thing screamed, it felt like ice water in my veins. Finally, as the sky began to lighten with the first grey light of dawn, the cries faded into the distance. We waited another hour before Uncle Dave cautiously opened the door and stepped outside, rifle at the ready. The morning was eerily still and quiet. No birds singing, no squirrels chattering. Just a heavy silence hanging over everything. We found huge, deep footprints in the mud around the cabin, prints bigger than any human foot, with long claw marks at the tips. Some of the trees had deep gouges torn into the bark, 7 or 8 feet off the ground. Uncle Dave's face was grim as he examined the tracks. "I've been hunting these woods for 40 years, he said. "Never seen anything like this. Never even heard stories of anything like this." We packed up and left that morning, the light of day doing little to ease the dread that had settled in my gut. On the drive home, my parents tried to rationalize what had happened. Maybe it was just some kind of weird atmospheric phenomenon, they said, or maybe someone was playing an elaborate prank. But I knew better. The memory of those glowing eyes in the darkness, the raw animal power in that unearthly shriek. It wasn't something that could be explained away. Something had been out there in those woods, something that defied explanation. I'm 38 years old now, with kids of my own, but I've never been camping since that night. Never been comfortable in the woods after dark. Because I know what's out there, lurking in the shadows. I know that some mysteries are better left unsolved, some dark corners of the world better left unexplored. And on quiet nights, when the wind is just right, I swear I can still hear that terrible scream echoing in the distance. A reminder that there are things in this world beyond our understanding, things that should be left alone. Story 16. I'll never forget that summer camping trip in 1995. My cousin Jake and I had been planning our mountain biking adventure in Vermont for months. We were both 19 at the time and eager to test our skills on some challenging trails. We set out early on a Saturday morning in late July, driving up from Massachusetts to the Green Mountain National Forest. The plan was to spend a few days biking and camping in the backcountry. We had all our gear packed: tents, sleeping bags, food, water, repair kits for the bikes. I remember feeling so excited as we hit the trails that first day, the cool forest air on my face as we navigated the twisting single track. By late afternoon, we'd covered a good 25 miles of trail. We were getting pretty tired and decided to look for a spot to set up camp for the night. As we came around a bend, we spotted a small wooden shelter just off the trail. It was a basic 3-sided lean-to structure, the kind often found along hiking trails for overnight stays. "Sweet, we lucked out," Jake said. "Way better than setting up tents." I agreed it would be more comfortable than sleeping on the ground. We wheeled our bikes over and started unloading our gear. The shelter was empty, with enough space for 4 or 5 people to sleep. There was a metal fire ring out front and a small stream burbling nearby. Seemed like the perfect spot. We got a fire going and heated up some freeze-dried meals for dinner. As the sun started to set, the forest grew incredibly still and quiet. No wind, no bird calls, just the faint trickle of the stream. I remember thinking how peaceful it was as we crawled into our sleeping bags. I'm not sure what time it was when I first woke up. Maybe 2 or 3 a.m. At first I wasn't sure what had disturbed me. Then I heard it. a soft thump against the outside wall of the shelter, right by my head. My heart started racing immediately. "Jake," I whispered urgently. "Jake, wake up." "Huh? What's wrong?" he mumbled groggily. "I heard something outside, like something hit the shelter." We lay there silently, straining our ears. After a minute, Jake whispered back, "I don't hear any thump." Louder this time, unmistakable. We both bolted upright. "What the hell was that?" Jake hissed. Before I could answer, there was another sharp bang, this time on the opposite wall. Then another, and another. It was like something was circling the shelter, hitting it from all sides. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what was happening. A bear, maybe? But the sounds were too deliberate, too rhythmic, like whatever it was testing the structure, probing for weaknesses. Suddenly, the entire shelter shook violently, as if something massive had slammed into it. I let out an involuntary yelp of terror. "Holy shit," Jake breathed. I could hear the fear in his voice. The pounding continued, growing more frenzied. It felt like the walls were going to cave in at any moment. I was paralyzed with fear, my sleeping bag pulled up to my chin like a shield. Then, as abruptly as it started, the assault stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. Jake and I lay there, barely daring to breathe, for what felt like hours. Eventually, faint pre-dawn light began to filter in through the open front of the shelter. As soon as it was bright enough to see, we scrambled out of our sleeping bags and bolted outside, terrified of what we might find, but needing to know what had happened. I'll never forget the confusion and disbelief I felt as we circled the shelter. There was nothing. No tracks in the dirt, no claw marks or dents in the wooden walls, not a single sign that anything had been there at all. "I don't understand," I said, my voice shaky. "How is this possible?" We both heard it, felt it. Jake just shook his head, looking as baffled and freaked out as I felt. We started packing up our gear in tense silence, both of us jumping at every little forest sound. There was an unspoken agreement that we needed to get the hell out of there as quickly as possible. As I was rolling up my sleeping bag, something caught my eye. There, stuck to the edge of the bag, was a single, long, coarse hair. It was dark brown, almost black, and at least 6 inches long. I showed it to Jake, whose eyes went wide. "That's not from either of us," he said, "and it's way too big to be from any normal forest animal." A chill ran down my spine. I carefully placed the hair in a small Ziploc bag and tucked it in my pack. We were on our bikes and hitting the trail within 15 minutes, pedaling hard to put as much distance between us and that shelter as we could. We didn't stop until we'd reached the main road and our parked car. The ride home was subdued, both of us lost in our own thoughts about what we'd experienced. When I got home, I immediately looked up information about strange encounters in the Vermont forests. I came across stories of Bigfoot sightings in the area that sounded eerily similar to what we'd gone through. I still have that hair sample. I've thought about getting it tested, but part of me is afraid of what the results might show. Sometimes I try to convince myself it was all just a vivid, shared hallucination brought on by being alone in the woods. But deep down, I know what I heard and felt that night was real. I've never been camping since then. The memory of those terrifying sounds and the violent shaking of the shelter is seared into my brain. Whatever was out there that night, it wasn't human. And it definitely wasn't any normal forest creature. Sometimes I still have nightmares about being trapped in that shelter as something massive and angry tries to break in. I wake up in a cold sweat, heart pounding, half expecting to hear that rhythmic thumping on my bedroom walls. Jake and I don't talk about that night much, but every once in a while, one of us will bring it up, usually after a few beers. We'll rehash the details, trying to make sense of it all these years later. we never reach any satisfying conclusions. All I know for certain is that something inexplicable and terrifying happened to us that summer night in the Vermont woods. And I hope to God I never experience anything like it again. Story 17. It was late afternoon, and the sun was starting to dip behind the rolling hills. We were on a winding back road, the kind that snakes through the countryside with barely enough room for 2 cars to pass. On one side was a steep, rocky slope covered in boulders and scrub brush. The other side dropped off sharply into a wooded valley. I was behind the wheel of our old Ford pickup, taking it slow around the curves. My wife Joan was in the passenger seat, fiddling with the radio, trying to find a station that wasn't pure static. We'd been chatting about maybe stopping in the next town for dinner, just enjoying each other's company and the drive. That's when I saw it out of the corner of my eye. At first, I thought it was just a shadow or trick of the fading light, but then I realized there was something moving on that rocky slope to our right, something big. "Hey, do you see that?" I said to Joan, nodding toward the hillside. She leaned forward, peering out the windshield. "See what? I don't—" "Oh my God." I slowed the truck to a crawl, both of us staring in disbelief. There was a massive, dark figure scrambling up the rocky incline with incredible speed and agility. It was at least 7 or 8 feet tall, covered in what looked like dark fur or hair. The way it moved was unreal, leaping from boulder to boulder, using its long arms to swing and propel itself upward. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. Joan grabbed my arm, her fingers digging in. "What is that thing?" she whispered. I couldn't answer. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Suddenly, the creature stopped. It was about 50 yards away, perched on an outcropping of rock. Then slowly, it turned and looked directly at us. I hit the brakes, the truck lurching to a stop. For a moment, we just stared at each other, us in stunned silence, and this being regarding us with what I can only describe as curiosity. Its face was mostly hidden in shadow, but I could make out 2 gleaming eyes reflecting the last of the daylight. The proportions were all wrong for a human. The arms were impossibly long, hanging down past its knees. The shoulders were massive and hunched, and the sheer size of it dwarfed any man I'd ever seen. I fumbled for the door handle, thinking I should get out and— What? Confront it? Run? I don't know. But Joan grabbed my arm harder. "Don't!" she hissed. "Just stay in the truck." Then the creature did something that chills me to this day when I think about it. It raised those long, powerful arms high over its head and waved at us. It wasn't a friendly gesture exactly. More like it was mimicking a human action it had seen before. Before I could react, it turned and launched itself further up the slope. The speed and grace were unbelievable. It moved like an Olympic gymnast, using its arms to swing from rock to rock, leaping impossible distances. Within seconds, it had disappeared over the crest of the hill. We sat there in shocked silence for I don't know how long. Finally, Joan's trembling voice broke the spell. Did that really just happen?" I put the truck in gear and stepped on the gas, tires squealing as we accelerated around the curve. My hands were shaking on the steering wheel. "I don't know," I said. "I honestly don't know what we just saw." We drove in tense silence for miles, both lost in our own thoughts. I kept replaying the encounter in my mind, trying to rationalize it. Could it have been a bear? No. The proportions were all wrong, and I'd never seen a bear move like that. A person in a costume. But how could anyone climb that slope with such inhuman agility? As we neared the next town, Joan finally spoke up. "We can't tell anyone about this," she said quietly. "They'll think we're crazy." I nodded, knowing she was right. Who would believe us? Hell, I'm not sure I believed it myself, and I was there. We stopped at a diner in town, both of us picking at our food, lost in thought. I could see the same questions spinning in Joan's eyes that were tumbling through my own mind. What was that thing? Why did it wave at us? Was it trying to communicate? And most chillingly, how long had it been watching us before we noticed it? The drive home was tense and quiet. We kept scanning the roadside, jumping at every shadow. When we finally got back to our house, we double-checked all the locks and drew the curtains tight. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that massive figure silhouetted against the twilight sky, those long arms raised in that eerie wave. I kept imagining I heard sounds outside, twigs snapping, heavy footsteps. Twice I got up to check, but there was nothing there. In the days and weeks that followed, Joan and I tried to make sense of what we'd seen. We pored over local newspapers, looking for any similar sightings or strange occurrences. We even made a discreet trip to the library to research local folklore and legends, but we found nothing concrete, just vague stories and rumors that didn't quite fit what we'd experienced. We debated reporting it to the authorities, but always came back to the same conclusion. Who would believe us? We'd be laughed out of the police station, or worse, branded as attention-seeking kooks. So we kept it to ourselves, this impossible secret. But it changed us. We became more wary, more alert to our surroundings. Camping trips and hikes in the woods, once a favorite pastime, now filled us with an undercurrent of dread. Every rustle in the underbrush, every shadow at dusk, made us tense up and scan for danger. It's been years now, and we've never seen anything like it again. But I still think about it almost every day. The memory is seared into my brain, that massive figure scrambling up the rocky slope with impossible grace, those long arms raised in that uncanny wave. Sometimes I wonder if it's still out there, moving through the forests and hills of Vermont, watching and waiting. And sometimes, on quiet nights when the wind whispers through the trees, I swear I can hear something moving outside, something big and fast and not quite human. I don't know what we saw that day in Rutland County. I don't know if it was some undiscovered species or something beyond our understanding of the natural world. But I do know this. It changed how I see the world forever. It opened my eyes to the possibility that there are things out there, hidden in the wild places, that defy explanation. And if you're ever driving those back roads of rural Vermont, keep your eyes on those rocky slopes and deep forests. You never know what might be watching you from the shadows. Story 18. It was a crisp autumn evening in Windsor County. Me and 5 of my buddies were heading back from a hunting trip up in the Green Mountains. We'd had decent luck, bagged a couple deer, but mostly we'd just enjoyed getting away from it all for a few days, drinking beers around the campfire and sharing stories. We were in my old Ford pickup, cruising down a lonely stretch of road surrounded by dense forest on both sides. The sun had set about an hour ago, and a full moon was rising, casting an eerie glow through the trees. I was behind the wheel, with my buddy Tom riding shotgun. The other 4 guys were crammed in the back, probably half asleep after a long day of tramping through the woods. We were all looking forward to getting home, showering off the grime, and crawling into our own beds. The radio was playing softly, some oldies station Tom had found. I remember House of the Rising Sun had just ended. We were chatting idly about plans for the weekend, nothing important. Suddenly, Tom sat bolt upright and pointed ahead. "What the hell is that?" he exclaimed. I squinted through the windshield, trying to make out what he was seeing in the shadows. At first I thought it might be a bear crossing the road. We'd seen a few on our trip. But as we got closer, I realized this was something else entirely. Illuminated in the headlights was a massive, hair-covered figure. It was standing upright on 2 legs, but it was huge, at least 7 or 8 feet tall. The body was thick and muscular, covered in dark, matted fur. As we approached, the creature turned its head and looked right at us. I'll never forget those eyes. They seemed to glow with an unnatural yellowish light. The face was a nightmarish mix of ape and man. A heavy brow ridge shadowed those terrifying eyes, and a broad, flat nose sat above a mouth full of gleaming teeth. For a split second, we just stared at each other in mutual shock. Then the thing moved. In a single, fluid motion, it crossed the entire width of the road. One giant stride, and it was gone, vanishing into the tree line on the far side. The grace and speed of the movement was unbelievable for something so large. I slammed on the brakes, the tires squealing on the asphalt. The truck fishtailed slightly before coming to a stop, right where the creature had been standing moments before. "Did you see that?" Tom was practically shouting. "Tell me you all saw that." The guys in the back were wide awake now, all talking at once. "What the hell was that thing?" "Jesus Christ, it was huge. Did you see how fast it moved?" I sat there gripping the steering wheel, my knuckles white, trying to process what I'd just witnessed. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. After a moment, I found my voice. "Everyone stay in the truck," I said, surprised at how steady I sounded. "I'm going to take a look." Ignoring the protests from my friends, I grabbed the flashlight from under the seat and climbed out. The night air was cool on my face and eerily quiet after the commotion in the truck. Crickets chirped in the underbrush, and somewhere in the distance, an owl hooted. I walked around to the front of the pickup, scanning the road with the flashlight beam. Right away I saw them. Footprints in the loose gravel on the shoulder, larger than any human foot I'd ever seen. They were at least 15 inches long and enormously wide, with what looked like claw marks at the ends of the toes. I followed the tracks to where they disappeared into the trees. The forest looked especially dark and forbidding. Every rustle of leaves made me jump. I had the distinct feeling of being watched. "Hey!" Tom called from the truck. "Don't go in there, man. Let's get out of here." Part of me wanted to follow those tracks, to try to get another glimpse of the creature. But common sense won out. Whatever that thing was, I didn't want to meet it alone in the dark woods. I hurried back to the truck and climbed in, locking the doors behind me. We sat there for a few minutes, no one speaking. The silence was broken only by our ragged breathing. Finally, Dave spoke up from the back. "We should report this, right? Call the cops or the Forest Service or something?" I shook my head. "And tell them what? That we saw Bigfoot? They'll think we're drunk or crazy." "Well, we can't just pretend it didn't happen," Tom argued. That thing is out there." In the end, we decided to keep it to ourselves, at least for the time being. Who would believe us anyway? But we made a pact to stick together and back up each other's story if we ever did decide to come forward. The rest of the drive home was tense and quiet. Every shadow on the roadside looked like a hulking monster ready to leap out at us. I don't think any of us truly relaxed until we were back in town, surrounded by the comforting glow of streetlights and houses. We went our separate ways that night, each to our own homes. But none of us slept well. I lay awake for hours, replaying the encounter in my mind. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that creature's face, those glowing eyes staring into mine. The next day, we met up to talk it over. In the light of day, it all seemed so surreal. Part of me wanted to believe it had been some kind of shared hallucination, but I knew what I'd seen. And the memory of those massive footprints in the gravel was all too real. We made a trip back out to the site, half hoping to find some evidence, half dreading what we might discover. But there was nothing. No tracks, no broken branches, no sign at all that anything unusual had happened there. It was just an ordinary stretch of road through the Vermont woods. Over the years, we've talked about that night many times, tried to make sense of it, to rationalize what we saw. But deep down, we all know the truth. For a few brief moments on that autumn night in 1964, we came face to face with something that shouldn't exist, something that science says is impossible. I've never been much for the supernatural. I'm not the type to believe in ghosts or UFOs or any of that nonsense. But I know what I saw. And sometimes late at night when the wind is howling through the trees, I find myself wondering, is it still out there, roaming the forests of New England, just beyond the reach of civilization? I don't go camping much these days, and when I do, I make damn sure to be back in town before nightfall, because the memory of those eyes still haunts me, and I never want to see them staring back at me from the darkness again. Story 19. It was around 3 a.m. when I jolted awake to an ear-piercing shriek outside my window. The sound was like nothing I'd ever heard before. Part scream, part whistle, entirely inhuman. My heart was pounding as I sat up in bed, straining my ears. For a few moments, there was only silence. Then I heard it again, closer this time. A high-pitched wail that made my skin crawl. I knew I should probably stay inside, but curiosity got the better of me. I grabbed my flashlight and hunting rifle and cautiously stepped out onto the porch. The night was eerily still. No wind, no sounds of animals or insects. Just an oppressive silence broken only by my own ragged breathing. As I swung my flashlight beam around, something caught my eye near the edge of the trees. Footprints. But these weren't animal tracks. They looked human, except they were enormous, easily 18 inches long. A chill ran down my spine as I followed the trail with my light. The prints led from the forest right up to my cabin, circling around it before heading back into the woods. I hesitated, every instinct screaming at me to go back inside and lock the door. But I had to know what made those tracks. So I set off following the footprints, my rifle clutched tightly. The beam of my flashlight bounced crazily as I picked my way through the underbrush. I could hear twigs snapping under my feet, sounding far too loud in the unnatural quiet. As I went deeper into the pines, a heavy, musty odor hit me. It was sickly sweet, like rotten cologne mixed with wet dog. The stench got stronger as I followed the prints. My stomach churned, and I had to fight the urge to gag. Suddenly, I heard a low growl from somewhere in the darkness ahead. I froze, my blood turning to ice. The growl came again, closer this time. Then I saw a pair of eyes reflecting my flashlight, huge eyes, set too high off the ground to be any normal animal. They blinked once, and I caught a glimpse of a massive, hair-covered form moving in the shadows. I don't remember deciding to run. 1 second I was rooted to the spot in terror, the next I was sprinting back towards my cabin as fast as my legs could carry me. Branches whipped at my face as I crashed through the woods. I could hear something large moving through the trees behind me, keeping pace effortlessly. Just as I reached the edge of the clearing around my cabin, my foot caught on a root, and I went sprawling. My flashlight flew from my hand, the beam spinning crazily. As I scrambled to my feet, I caught sight of a huge ape-like figure, illuminated for a split second in the sweeping light. It was at least 8 feet tall, covered in dark fur. Not a bear, not a man, but something in between. I didn't stop to get a better look. I sprinted the last few yards to my cabin and slammed the door behind me, my hands shaking so badly I could barely work the locks. For hours, I huddled in the dark with my rifle, listening to heavy footsteps circling outside. Occasionally, I'd hear that bone-chilling shriek again, sometimes so close it seemed to be right outside my window. As the sky began to lighten with the approaching dawn, the noises finally stopped. When I worked up the courage to peek outside, there was no sign of the creature, just those massive footprints in the dirt and that lingering musky odor hanging in the air. I tried to convince myself it had all been some kind of vivid nightmare, but the tracks were still there, circling my cabin, and over the next few weeks I'd sometimes catch glimpses of a large, shadowy form moving at the edge of the woods. I'd find strange tufts of coarse hair snagged on tree branches. Once I even found what looked like a half-eaten deer carcass, torn apart by incredibly strong hands. I never saw the creature clearly again after that night, but I knew it was out there, watching. The piercing shrieks would wake me some nights, always seeming to come from a different direction. I'd find new tracks around my property, disturbingly close to the cabin. The fear and stress were overwhelming. I couldn't sleep, couldn't focus on anything. I kept my rifle by my side constantly. After a month of this, I couldn't take it anymore. I packed up and left, abandoning the cabin and never looking back. To this day, I have no explanation for what I encountered in those Vermont woods. I've read about Bigfoot sightings and wondered if that's what I saw. But somehow, the reality felt far more terrifying than any legend or campfire story. Whatever it was intelligent, predatory, and not of this world as we know it. I still have nightmares about those glowing eyes in the dark, that inhuman scream. Sometimes I wake up in a cold sweat, certain I can smell that sickly sweet musk. I've never been camping again, never spent a night alone in the woods. The solitude I once loved now fills me with dread. I don't expect anyone to believe my story. Hell, most days I have trouble believing it myself. But I know what I saw, what I experienced. And I know that there are things out there in the wilderness that defy explanation, things that are better left alone. If you're ever hiking in the forests of Vermont and hear a sound like a scream and whistle combined, my advice is to run. Run and don't look back. You might not be as lucky as I was. Story 20. It was around 2 a.m. when I was jolted awake by the most blood-curdling scream I've ever heard in my life. It didn't sound human or like any animal I knew. It was this guttural, primal roar that seemed to shake the whole cabin. I sat bolt upright in bed, my heart pounding out of my chest. Every hair on my body stood on end. I was paralyzed with fear, unable to move or even breathe for what felt like minutes. As the echo of that ungodly shriek faded, an eerie silence fell over everything. The usual nighttime sounds of the forest, crickets, owls, wind in the trees, had all gone dead quiet. It was as if the whole world was holding its breath, waiting. I finally managed to shake off the paralysis and reached for the hunting rifle I keep by my bed. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely grip it. I strained my ears, listening for any sound of movement outside. For a few tense minutes, there was nothing. Then I heard it, heavy footsteps crunching through the underbrush, coming closer to the cabin. Whatever it was big, really big. Each thunderous step made the floorboards vibrate. I was trying to muster the courage to look out the window when suddenly there was a deafening crash from downstairs. The whole cabin shook like it had been hit by a wrecking ball. I nearly jumped out of my skin. More sounds of destruction filtered up from below. Wood splintering, metal clanging, glass shattering. Something was in my basement, and it was tearing the place apart. I was beyond terrified at this point. Part of me wanted to barricade myself in the bedroom, but I knew I had to see what was happening. Clutching my rifle, I crept to the top of the stairs on trembling legs. The noises from the basement had stopped. Now I could hear heavy breathing and sniffing, like a dog trying to catch a scent, but much, much bigger. I inched down the stairs, willing each step not to creak. When I reached the bottom, I saw that the basement door had been completely torn off its hinges. This was a solid oak door, 2 inches thick. The sheer strength it would take to rip it away was mind-boggling. Peering around the doorframe, I caught a glimpse of something massive moving in the darkness of the basement. I couldn't make out any clear shape, just an enormous shadowy form. It had to be at least 8 feet tall. My legs nearly gave out. I wanted to run, to scream, to do something, but I was frozen in place, barely able to breathe. The creature let out a low, rumbling growl that I felt in my bones. Then it started coming toward the stairs, toward me. I don't know how, but I managed to scramble back up to the main floor. I slammed the door at the top of the stairs and threw the bolt, for all the good it would do. Then I retreated to the far corner of the living room, rifle trained on the door. I could hear it climbing the stairs, each wooden step groaning under its weight. When it reached the top, the door handle rattled. Then silence. For several agonizing minutes, nothing happened. Had it given up? Gone away? I didn't dare hope. Suddenly, an overpowering musky odor filled the air. It was unlike anything I'd smelled before. A combination of wet dog, rotting vegetation, and something else I couldn't identify. The stench was so strong it made my eyes water. Just when I thought I couldn't take the suspense anymore, there was a snuffling sound right outside the living room window. I whirled around, rifle at the ready. For a split second, I saw it. A huge, dark shape, easily 9 feet tall, covered in shaggy hair, and staring right at me with glowing red eyes. I fired on pure instinct. The gunshot was deafening in the small cabin, but by the time my vision cleared, the thing was gone. I spent the rest of the night huddled in that corner, jumping at every little sound. When dawn finally broke, I ventured outside on shaky legs to survey the damage. The basement door was in splinters. My tools and supplies were scattered everywhere, but what really chilled me to the bone were the footprints. Massive, bare footprints, easily 20 inches long, pressed deep into the mud outside. And on the cabin wall, a gigantic handprint, caked in dirt, at least twice the size of my own hand. I sat there on my porch steps for a long time, trying to process what had happened, trying to rationalize it. But I knew in my gut that I'd encountered something that shouldn't exist, something that defied explanation. I called the sheriff, but of course they didn't believe me. Said it was probably just a bear, even though we'd never had grizzlies in Vermont. They clearly thought I was some paranoid old coot who'd had too much to drink. But I know what I saw, what I heard, what I smelled. It's been almost 40 years, and I've never spoken publicly about that night. Who would believe me? But I still have nightmares about those glowing red eyes. Still wake up in a cold sweat, certain I can hear that inhuman scream echoing through the trees. I don't know what it was that invaded my home that spring night in '84. Bigfoot, Sasquatch, some unknown creature. I can't say for sure. All I know is that it was real, and it was terrifying beyond words. I moved away from that cabin not long after. Couldn't stand to be there anymore. But sometimes I wonder, is it still out there in those Vermont woods? Waiting, watching. I pray I never find out. Story 21. It was a cool autumn night, and I had my bedroom window cracked open to let in the fresh air. I've always been a night owl, so I was up late reading in bed as usual. It must have been close to midnight when I heard some rustling sounds coming from outside. At first I didn't think much of it. We often had deer and other wildlife roaming around at night, but something about the sound made me pause. It was heavier, more deliberate than a deer, almost like footsteps. I got up and went to the window, peering out into the darkness. The moon was nearly full that night, casting an eerie glow over the yard. As my eyes adjusted, I could make out a large, dark shape moving at the edge of the tree line. My heart started racing as I realized this was no ordinary animal. Whatever it was massive, at least 7 or 8 feet tall, and it was walking on 2 legs. I stood frozen at the window, barely daring to breathe. The creature emerged fully from the shadows of the trees, and I got my first clear look at it. It was unlike anything I'd ever seen before. The body was covered in dark, shaggy fur, but the face is what I remember most vividly. It wasn't quite human, but it wasn't fully animal either. The features were a bizarre mix of ape-like and humanoid. The eyes were deep-set under a prominent brow ridge. The nose was wide and flat. The mouth seemed almost too wide for the face, with thin lips pulled back slightly. As it walked across the yard, I was struck by how strangely it moved. Its gait was uneven and awkward. The arms swung exaggeratedly with each step, almost reaching the ground. I estimated it must have weighed at least 350 pounds. The body was barrel-chested and powerfully built. The legs were relatively short and bowed outward slightly. At this point, my mind was reeling. What the hell was I looking at? Some kind of escaped gorilla? A man in a costume? But deep down, I knew it was neither of those things. This was something else. Suddenly, the creature stopped walking and slowly turned its head toward my window. My blood ran cold as our eyes met. Its gaze was unnervingly intelligent and aware. For several long seconds, we just stared at each other. I was paralyzed with fear, unable to move or look away. The creature's eyes seemed to bore right through me. Then, without warning, it turned and began lumbering up the hill behind my house. Its long arms swung as it walked, occasionally using them to grip trees or rocks to help climb the slope. I watched, still frozen in place, as it disappeared into the thick forest at the top of the hill. Only when it was completely out of sight did I finally snap out of my trance-like state. I stumbled back from the window, my legs shaky. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear the blood rushing in my ears. I felt dizzy and nauseous as the adrenaline coursed through my body. For the rest of the night, I sat huddled in my bed with all the lights on, jumping at every little sound. I didn't dare look out the window again. When morning finally came, I went outside to look for tracks or any other evidence. But the ground was hard and dry. There was nothing to be found. I spent the next few days in a daze, questioning my sanity. Had I really seen what I thought I saw? Was it just a vivid hallucination? But deep down, I knew the truth. What I had witnessed that night was all too real. I've never told many people about what happened. Who would believe me? I know how it sounds, but I know what I saw. In the years since, I've done a lot of research trying to make sense of my experience. I've read about Bigfoot and other cryptid sightings. Some of the descriptions match eerily well with what I saw that night, but I've never had another encounter like it. Sometimes I wonder if I ever will. Part of me hopes I do, just to validate what happened. But another part of me is terrified at the thought of seeing that creature again. To this day, I still get chills when I think about those eyes staring back at me. The intelligence I saw there, it wasn't animal, but it wasn't quite human either. It was something in between, something that shouldn't exist. I don't know what's out there in the forests of Vermont, but I know that night changed how I see the world. There are things in this world that defy explanation. Things that lurk just beyond the edge of what we understand. I'll never forget that creature's face, or the way it moved. The memory is seared into my mind forever. Sometimes I still have nightmares about it, those eyes watching me from the darkness. I don't expect anyone to believe my story. Hell, there are times I can barely believe it myself. But I know what I saw that night was real. And I know I'll be looking over my shoulder for the rest of my life, wondering if it's out there watching me. Story 22. I still remember that fateful expedition like it was yesterday, even though it's been over 260 years. The year was 1759, and I was serving as a ranger under the command of Major Robert Rogers in the northern Vermont territory. We'd been tasked with scouting the wilderness, mapping the terrain, and keeping an eye out for any French or Indian forces in the area. Little did we know that we were about to encounter something far stranger and more terrifying than any human enemy. It was early autumn, and the leaves were just starting to turn. We'd been trekking through dense forest for days, our boots caked with mud, our uniforms damp and uncomfortable. The nights were getting colder, and an eerie mist seemed to cling to the forest floor each morning. As we made our way through a particularly thick grove of pine trees, I noticed something odd. Pine cones and acorns kept falling all around us, as if being thrown. At first I dismissed it as squirrels or birds, but the barrage continued even when there was no wind. Some of the projectiles seemed to be aimed directly at us. "Keep alert, men," Major Rogers called out. "Something's not right here." We pressed on warily, hands on our muskets. That's when we heard it. A low, guttural growl, unlike anything I'd ever heard before. It seemed to come from all around us at once. Private Thompson let out a yelp as something grabbed his ankle, yanking him off his feet. We all spun around, muskets raised, but there was nothing there. Just Thompson sprawled on the ground, looking pale and shaken. "Did you see it?" he gasped. "It was huge, covered in dark, wet-looking fur." Major Rogers ordered us into a defensive formation as we helped Thompson to his feet. That's when the trees around us began to shake violently. Through the foliage, I caught glimpses of a massive, shadowy form moving with incredible speed and agility. Whatever this thing was, it was no bear or wildcat. It moved on two legs like a man, but was far larger and more powerful than any human. As we stumbled backwards, trying to keep our eyes on the creature, it let out a bone-chilling roar that seemed to shake the very ground. Several of the men cried out in terror. I'm not ashamed to admit that I very nearly soiled myself. "Hold steady!" Rogers bellowed. "Present arms!" We raised our muskets as one, but before we could fire, the creature burst through the tree line. I only saw it for a split second, but the image is seared into my mind forever. It stood at least 8 feet tall, with long, muscular limbs and a broad, sloping forehead. Its entire body was covered in dark, matted fur that glistened as if wet. But it was the eyes that haunted me, gleaming with a cold, alien intelligence. The beast let out another ear-splitting roar and charged straight at us. Rogers gave the order to fire, and our muskets erupted in a deafening volley. Smoke filled the air, momentarily obscuring our view. When it cleared, the creature was gone. We waited in tense silence for several minutes, expecting it to burst out of the woods at any moment, but there was nothing, no movement, no sound. Cautiously we advanced to where it had been standing. The ground was torn up as if by massive claws, and several trees had been snapped like twigs. But there was no blood, no sign that our shots had found their mark. "What in God's name was that thing?" Private Williams whispered. "I don't know," Rogers replied grimly. "But we're getting out of these woods, now." We marched double time back the way we had come, jumping at every snapping twig or rustle of leaves. As the sun began to set, we finally reached the edge of the forest and made camp in an open field, posting extra guards. That night, huddled around the campfire, some of the local guides told us what they knew of the creature. They called it the wet scheme, or wet skin, a monstrous being that had terrorized the region for generations. It was said to chase livestock, tear down fences, and hurl objects at travelers who ventured too deep into its domain. Always walking on 2 legs, always displaying an unnerving intelligence and hatred toward humans. I barely slept that night, my mind racing with images of that terrifying encounter. In the morning, we found massive, inhuman footprints circling our camp, coming right up to the edge of our sentry line. How none of the guards had seen or heard anything, I'll never know. As we prepared to move out, Major Rogers gathered us all together. "Men, I know we've all been shaken by what we experienced yesterday, but we have a duty to perform, and perform it we shall. We'll skirt the edge of the forest and complete our mission. But I want you all on high alert. Whatever that creature was, it's still out there." For the next week, we continued our scouting expedition, always keeping the deep woods to our left as we mapped the territory. We didn't see the creature again, but we often felt as if we were being watched. Strange noises echoed from the forest at night, and we'd occasionally find those massive footprints near our camp in the morning. On our final day, as we were breaking camp to begin the journey home, I wandered a short distance away to refill my canteen at a stream. As I knelt by the water, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. Slowly, I turned around. There it was, standing at the edge of the tree line about 50 yards away. In the clear morning light, I could see it in much greater detail. Its muscular frame was covered in thick, dark fur that did indeed look perpetually wet. Its face was a disturbing mix of ape-like and human features, with deep-set eyes that bored into me with frightening intensity. For a long moment, we simply stared at each other. I was frozen in terror, unable to call out to my companions or reach for my weapon. The creature tilted its head slightly, as if studying me. Then, to my utter astonishment, it raised one massive hand and pointed directly at me before turning and loping off into the forest on 2 legs. I sat there trembling for several minutes before I managed to stumble back to camp and recount what had happened. Major Rogers immediately ordered us to break camp and move out, not stopping until we were well clear of the area. In the years since, I've often wondered about that final encounter. Why did it point at me? Was it a warning, a threat, some attempt at communication? I'll likely never know. What I do know is that there are things in this world beyond our understanding, creatures that defy explanation, that blur the line between man and beast. I've seen one with my own eyes, felt the primal terror of being in its presence. Sometimes on dark nights when the wind howls through the trees, I still dream of those cold, intelligent eyes staring into my soul. And I wonder, is it still out there, lurking in the shadowy depths of the forest? Waiting, watching. I pray I never have to find out. Story 23. My little brother Tommy and I were playing in the meadow behind our family's farmhouse, like we did most summer afternoons. At 12 years old, I was getting a bit too old for childish games, but I still enjoyed spending time with 8-year-old Tommy. We were running around, pretending to be explorers discovering a new land, when I noticed something odd out of the corner of my eye. At first I thought it was just a trick of the light or my imagination, but as I turned to look directly at it, I felt my blood run cold. There, partially hidden behind a fallen log about 50 feet away, was something. It was small, maybe 3 or 4 feet tall, and covered in reddish-orange hair. For a split second, I wondered if it was some kind of strange animal that had wandered onto our property, but then it moved. It wasn't just moving randomly, though. It was mimicking us. As Tommy ran in a circle with his arms out like airplane wings, this creature made the same motions behind the log. When I stopped and put my hands on my hips, it did the same. It was eerie and unnatural, like watching a monstrous puppet copying our every move. I grabbed Tommy's arm, my eyes never leaving the thing behind the log. "Tommy, do you see that?" I whispered urgently. He looked where I was pointing and his eyes went wide. "What is it, Billy?" he asked, his voice shaking. "I don't know, but we need to go get Pa," I said, trying to keep my voice steady for Tommy's sake even as terror gripped me. We started backing away slowly, not wanting to make any sudden movements. But as soon as we turned to run, we heard a horrific shriek behind us. It was unlike anything I'd ever heard before, not quite human, not quite animal, but something in between that made every hair on my body stand on end. We sprinted back to the house as fast as our legs could carry us. I could hear heavy, rapid footsteps behind us for a few seconds before they faded away. We burst through the back door, breathless and terrified. "Pa! Pa!" we yelled in unison. Our father came running from the front of the house. "What in tarnation is going on?" he demanded. Between gasps for air, we tried to explain what we'd seen. Pa's brow furrowed as he listened. He was a skeptical man by nature, not one to believe in monsters or fairy tales. But he could see how genuinely frightened we were. "All right, boys, let's go take a look," he said, grabbing his shotgun from above the fireplace. "Betty, you stay here with the little ones," he told our mother. Pa whistled for our neighbor, Mr. Johnson, who was working in the field nearby. The four of us, Pa, Mr. Johnson, Tommy, and I, headed back out to the meadow where we'd seen the creature. I was shaking like a leaf, both dreading and hoping we'd see it again. Part of me wanted proof that I wasn't going crazy, but mostly I just wanted it to be gone. As we approached the fallen log, I could feel the tension in the air. Pa and Mr. Johnson had their guns at the ready. Tommy was clinging to my arm so tightly it almost hurt. We all scanned the area, looking for any sign of movement. For a long moment, everything was still and silent. Then suddenly, without warning, it happened. The creature exploded out from under the log with another piercing shriek. In the split second before it leapt away, I got a clear look at it for the first time. It was like nothing I'd ever seen before or since. Its body was covered in shaggy, reddish-orange hair, almost the color of flames. Its face was eerily human-like, with deep-set eyes that seemed to glow with an unnatural intelligence. But its mouth, God, its mouth! It was far too wide for its face, stretching from ear to ear and filled with sharp, yellowed teeth. Before anyone could react, the thing leapt an impossible distance, it must have been 20 or 30 feet, and disappeared into the dense undergrowth at the edge of the woods. Pa and Mr. Johnson fired their guns, but it was already long gone. We searched the area for hours, looking for any trace of the creature. But aside from some flattened grass where it had been hiding and a few broken branches where it had landed, there was nothing. No footprints, no hair, nothing to prove what we'd seen was real. In the days and weeks that followed, rumors spread through the county like wildfire. Some folks believed us, claiming they'd seen strange things in the woods themselves. Others thought we were lying or had imagined it all. A few hunters tried to track the creature, but they never found anything. As time passed, life went back to normal for most people. But for me, things were never the same. I couldn't shake the memory of those glowing eyes, that inhuman shriek. I had nightmares for years. Even now, as an old man, I sometimes wake up in a cold sweat, convinced I can hear that creature's cry echoing in the distance. I've spent countless hours trying to make sense of what happened that day. Was it some kind of undiscovered animal, a creature from another world, or something even stranger that defies explanation? I don't know if I'll ever have answers, but I do know this. There are things in this world beyond our understanding, things that lurk in the shadows just out of sight. And sometimes when we least expect it, they reveal themselves in terrifying ways. I've never told this story publicly before. For years, I was afraid people would think I was crazy. But now, in my twilight years, I feel compelled to share it. Not to convince anyone or seek validation, but simply to unburden myself of this weight I've carried for so long. To this day, I can't look at the color orange without feeling a chill run down my spine. I avoid the woods whenever possible, and I've never let my own children play unsupervised in open fields. Some might call it paranoia, but they weren't there. They didn't see what I saw. I often wonder if that creature is still out there somewhere, hiding in the wilderness of Vermont. Has it been watching us all these years, mimicking our movements from afar? Or was that encounter just a fleeting moment, never to be repeated? I suppose I'll never know for certain. But one thing's for sure. I'll never forget that summer day in 1877 when my understanding of the world was shattered in an instant. It serves as a constant reminder that there are mysteries in this universe far beyond our comprehension, and sometimes it's best to simply accept that there are some questions we may never be able to answer. As I sit here writing this, I can almost feel those eyes on me again. It's probably just my imagination playing tricks on me after reliving these memories. At least, that's what I tell myself. But a part of me will always wonder, what if it's not just in my mind? What if, even after all these years, It's still out there, watching, waiting. I know this story might be hard for some to believe. If I hadn't lived through it myself, I'm not sure I would believe it either. But I swear on everything I hold dear that every word I've written here is true. I can only hope that by sharing my experience, I might bring some comfort to others who have encountered things they can't explain. You're not alone, and you're not crazy. There are things in this world that defy explanation, and sometimes all we can do is acknowledge their existence and try to move forward with our lives. To anyone reading this who might be skeptical, I don't blame you, but I urge you to keep an open mind. The world is a far stranger and more mysterious place than most of us realize, and sometimes the things we dismiss as impossible are the very things waiting to prove us wrong when we least expect it. As for me, I'll continue to live with the memory of that day, both a burden and a reminder of the vast unknown that surrounds us. And perhaps, in some small way, sharing this story will help me finally find some peace with the inexplicable terror I witnessed so many years ago. Story 24. I was just a young logger back in '51, working the forests of Addison County with my buddy Kennedy. We were both in our early 20s, strong as oxen and cocky as roosters. Thought we knew everything there was to know about those woods. Boy, were we wrong. It was a crisp February morning when it all went down, the kind of cold that bites at your nose and makes your breath steam like a locomotive. Kennedy and I had driven out to the worksite before dawn, ready to fire up the old tractor and get to clearing some timber. As we pulled up in Kennedy's beat-up Ford, something felt off right away. Can't explain it, just a chill down my spine that had nothing to do with the weather. The tractor was right where we'd left it the day before, but something was missing. "Hey, John," Kennedy called out, "where's that fuel drum?" I squinted through the dim, early light. Sure enough, the big 55-gallon drum we used to refuel the tractor was gone. Now, this wasn't just any old barrel. This thing was a beast, must have weighed close to 450 pounds when full, and I knew for a fact we'd left it nearly full yesterday. "Maybe the boss came by and moved it," I suggested, but even as I said it, I knew that made no sense. Why would anyone move a drum that heavy, especially in the dark? We started looking around, figuring maybe it had somehow rolled away, though the ground was pretty flat. That's when Kennedy spotted something that made my blood run cold. "John, come look at this." I walked over to where he was standing, about 20 feet from the tractor. There, clear as day in the soft earth, was a footprint, but not like any footprint I'd ever seen before. It was huge, must have been 20 inches long if it was an inch. The shape was all wrong too. 5 toes, but they were curved down, like whatever made it was grabbing the ground. And the depth. Whatever left that print had to be incredibly heavy. "What the hell made that?" I whispered, my voice shaking more than I'd like to admit. Kennedy just shook his head, his face pale. "Let's follow them," he said after a moment. "Maybe they'll lead us to the drum." Part of me wanted to hightail it out of there, but curiosity got the better of me. We started following the tracks, leading away from the tractor and deeper into the woods. The prints were spaced far apart, like whatever made them had a massive stride. Every so often, we'd see where branches had been snapped off trees, way higher than either of us could reach. After about a quarter mile, Kennedy grabbed my arm. "Look," he hissed, pointing ahead. There, wedged between 2 big pines, was our missing fuel drum. But that wasn't what made my heart nearly stop. No, it was the massive, hairy shape crouched next to it. At first, I thought it was a bear. But as my eyes adjusted to the gloom, I realized this was no bear. It was standing upright, for one thing, easily 8 feet tall. The body was covered in thick, matted fur, but the face... God, the face was almost human, but twisted, primitive. It was hunched over the drum, massive hands wrapped around it. As we watched, frozen in terror, it lifted the 450-pound barrel like it was nothing more than a gallon jug of milk. That's when it turned and saw us. I've never heard a sound like the one that creature made. It was a roar, but mixed with something almost like words. The noise echoed through the trees, sending birds scattering in panic. Kennedy and I didn't wait around. We turned and ran faster than I've ever run in my life. Branches whipped at our faces, roots tried to trip us up, but we didn't slow down. Behind us, I could hear the thing crashing through the underbrush, getting closer with each massive stride. We burst out of the tree line near where we'd parked. Kennedy fumbled with his keys, dropping them twice before managing to unlock the truck. We piled in, and he cranked the engine. As we peeled out onto the logging road, I looked in the side mirror. There, at the edge of the woods, stood the creature. It was just watching us, those two human eyes reflecting the early morning light. We drove straight to the sheriff's office, babbling about what we'd seen. Of course, they didn't believe us. Said we must have been drinking or that it was just a big bear. They sent a couple deputies out to check, but of course by then the thing was long gone. All they found were our tracks and some unusual disturbances they blamed on moose or elk. The fuel drum turned up about a week later, dented all to hell and empty. The sheriff said some kids must have stolen it as a prank, but Kennedy and I knew better. I've spent the last 70 years trying to make sense of what I saw that day. Was it a Bigfoot, some kind of primitive man, or something else entirely? I don't know. But I do know this. There are things in those woods that defy explanation. Things that remind us that for all our supposed civilization, we're still just visitors in the wild places of the world. I never went back to that logging site. Quit the job the very next day. Kennedy stuck it out for another month before he too called it quits. We don't talk about that day much, even with each other. Some things are just too big, too strange to put into words. But on cold nights, when the wind howls through the trees, I still sometimes hear that roar. And I wonder if, somewhere out in the dark forests of Vermont, that creature is still out there watching and waiting. Story 25. I still remember that day in September 1975 like it was yesterday. The leaves were just starting to change color, painting the Vermont countryside in vibrant reds and golds. My buddies Tom and Mike had come up from Boston for our annual hunting trip in the Mimicking National Wildlife Refuge. We'd been looking forward to it for months, a chance to get away from the city, breathe in that crisp autumn air, and hopefully bag a few ducks. We'd set up our little camp near the edge of the refuge, not far from where the Mimicking River empties into Lake Champlain. It was a beautiful spot, surrounded by dense forest and wetlands teeming with wildlife. That particular morning, we'd gotten up before dawn to try our luck in one of the marshy areas where we'd seen a lot of waterfowl activity the day before. After a few hours with no luck, we decided to take a break and do some exploring. There were old tractor trails crisscrossing through parts of the refuge, left over from when it used to be farmland decades ago. We figured we'd follow one of them deeper into the woods, maybe scout out some new hunting spots for the next day. It was close to midday by then, and the forest was alive with the sounds of birds and small animals. The trail we were on wound through a mix of hardwoods and evergreens, dappled sunlight filtering down through the canopy. We were walking single file, with me in the lead, when I suddenly stopped dead in my tracks. There, maybe 50 yards ahead of us on the trail, was something. At first glance, I thought it might have been a bear standing on its hind legs. But as I focused on it, I realized this was something else entirely. It was enormous, easily 8 feet tall, maybe more. And the proportions were all wrong for a bear. It had these incredibly long legs and arms, with broad, sloping shoulders that tapered down to a smaller waist. The whole body was covered in dark, shaggy hair. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I could hear Tom and Mike behind me, their hushed whispers of, What the hell is that? Barely audible over the blood rushing in my ears. The creature hadn't seen us yet. It was just ambling along the trail, almost casually, its long arms swinging slightly with each step. Despite its relaxed gait, it was covering ground incredibly quickly. Those long legs ate up the distance effortlessly. I found myself mesmerized by its fluid, almost graceful movement. It didn't move like any animal I'd ever seen before. We must have stood there watching it for a few minutes, though it felt like hours. I was too shocked to even think about grabbing my camera from my backpack. All I could do was stare, trying to process what I was seeing. Suddenly, without any apparent reason, the creature stopped. It turned its head slowly, almost as if it was scenting the air. And then, in one smooth motion, it stepped off the trail and into the thick underbrush. Within seconds, it had vanished completely, swallowed up by the dense forest. The spell broken, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. My legs felt weak, and I had to sit down right there on the trail. Tom and Mike were equally shaken. We sat there for a while, trying to make sense of what we'd just witnessed. Did you guys see that? I finally managed to stammer out. Tom nodded, his face pale. I saw it, but I don't believe it. That couldn't have been real, right? Mike was quieter, his brow furrowed in concentration. I've heard stories, he said slowly. My grandpa used to talk about something the old-timers called the Wendigo up in these parts. But I always thought they were just campfire tales. We debated what to do next. Part of me wanted to follow the creature, to try and get another look, or maybe find some evidence. But a larger part was terrified at the thought of encountering it again, especially in the thicker woods where we'd be at a disadvantage. In the end, we decided to head back to camp. We were all too rattled to continue our trip as planned. As we hiked back, we kept jumping at every snapping twig or rustle in the underbrush. The forest that had seemed so peaceful that morning now felt oppressive and threatening. Back at camp, we packed up our gear in record time. None of us wanted to spend another night out there. The drive back to Boston was tense, filled with long silences punctuated by attempts to rationalize what we'd seen. Maybe it was just a really big bear, Tom suggested at one point, not sounding convinced even as he said it. No bear moves like that, Mike countered. And did you see how it just disappeared into the woods? No way a bear that size could move so quietly. I mostly stayed quiet, replaying the encounter over and over in my mind. The image of that creature was burned into my memory. Its impossible height, the way it moved, the sheer alienness of it in that familiar forest setting. In the days and weeks that followed, I tried to find some explanation for what we'd seen. I researched local wildlife, looked into reports of unusual animal sightings in the area, even delved into some of the Native American legends about forest spirits and creatures. Nothing quite fit. I considered reporting our sighting to the authorities or to some cryptozoology groups, but ultimately decided against it. Who would believe us? 3 guys who'd been out in the woods all day, probably dehydrated and tired. It would be easy to dismiss our story as a shared hallucination or a misidentified bear. But I know what I saw that day. It wasn't a bear or a moose or any other animal native to those woods. It was something else, something that shouldn't exist but somehow does. It's been over 45 years since that day, and I've never been back to those woods. Tom and Mike and I don't talk about it much anymore, but I know it affected them as deeply as it did me. Sometimes on crisp autumn days when the leaves are changing, I find myself thinking about that creature. I wonder if it's still out there, roaming those forests, occasionally startling some unsuspecting hiker or hunter. I don't expect anyone to believe this story. Hell, there are days I have trouble believing it myself. But I know what I saw that September day in 1975. And I know that there are things out there in this world that defy explanation, things that remind us that for all our knowledge and technology, nature still holds mysteries we can't begin to understand.